There was a pale, serious boy in Munich who spent his nights staring at the ceiling of his small room, imagining himself as one of the iron-willed heroes from the old German tales, strong enough to protect a nation that already felt as fragile as his own body. Heinrich Himmler grew up in a modest apartment where order was the family religion and weakness was treated like a visitor who had overstayed its welcome. His father, Gebhard, was a schoolteacher who carried himself with the quiet certainty of a man who believed discipline could shape any future. In the evenings, after the lamps were lit, he would sit at the head of the table and speak of duty, of the German people's rightful place in the world, of the need for young men to harden themselves against softness. Heinrich listened with his whole being. He was not a loud child or a defiant one. He was the kind of boy who watched the adults carefully, trying to decode what it took to earn their respect without ever quite feeling he measured up. His body made the task harder. From childhood he was small for his age, prone to lingering colds and breathing troubles that kept him indoors on days when other boys ran through the parks or played soldier in the streets. There were mornings when he woke already tired, his chest tight, and he would lie still for a moment listening to the sounds of the city waking outside his window, tram bells, cartwheels on cobblestones, the distant call of a street vendor. In those quiet minutes he felt the gap between the warrior he wanted to be and the boy whose lungs betrayed him. He hated that gap. He began to believe, in the way children do, that if he could just master himself completely, rise earlier, study longer, ignore the aches, then the weakness would eventually surrender. His mother, Anna, moved through the same rooms with a different kind of steadiness. She worried over him without making a show of it, bringing an extra blanket when the nights turned cold or sitting beside his bed when fever kept him awake. In those hours she sometimes read to him from the heavy volumes his father kept on the shelves. The stories were always the same kind, ancient tribes who had held their ground against empires, medieval knights bound by codes of honor, leaders who had forged unity out of chaos through sheer force of will. Heinrich would close his eyes and place himself inside those tales. In them, strength was not something you were born with. It was something you earned through loyalty, through sacrifice, through refusing to bend. The Germany in those pages was vast, proud, and whole. The Germany he saw when he looked out the window, still recovering from the upheavals of the previous century, still carrying old wounds, felt smaller and more uncertain by comparison. At school he was diligent in a way that set him apart without making him popular. His notebooks were models of neatness, every line straight, every date recorded. Teachers praised his application but rarely his spark. Classmates sometimes called him the little professor behind his back, and the nickname stung more than he let anyone see. He was not built for the rough and tumble of the schoolyard, so he found other ways to belong. He read. He organized his small collection of books and papers with the care of someone already practicing for a larger responsibility. He began to keep a diary, filling its pages with careful observations about his own conduct, how many hours he had studied, whether he had allowed himself to complain when he felt unwell, what new fact about German history he had mastered that day. The diary became a private court in which he judged himself daily. In its pages he could be the stern commander he wished the world would see. The war that broke out when he was 13 only sharpened every longing he already carried. Munich filled with flags and marching songs. Young men left for the front with flowers in their buttonholes and promises in their eyes. Heinrich stood among the crowds that cheered them off and felt a fierce, private envy. He was too young to go, but he told himself that when his turn came he would not hesitate. He followed the bulletins posted outside the newspaper offices, reading the lists of victories and, later, the lengthening lists of names that never returned. At the dinner table his father spoke of the conflict as a test that would prove Germany's character once and for all. Heinrich absorbed the words like scripture. If the nation held together, if every citizen did his duty without complaint, then the weakness that had haunted Germany for generations would finally be burned away. He began to exercise in his room despite the coughing fits that sometimes followed, push-ups on the cold floor, deep breathing by the open window, anything that might turn his frail frame into something harder. The years dragged. Food grew scarce. The streets grew tense. Letters from the front arrived with longer silences between them. Heinrich watched his father's face change, the lines around the mouth deepening, the voice growing quieter when the news was bad. He saw, without fully understanding, how a whole country could begin to doubt itself. And still he clung to the stories. In his diary he wrote of the need for self-mastery, for a purity of purpose that no setback could shake. He was not yet political in any organized sense. He was simply a boy trying to armor himself against a world that kept reminding him of his smallness. Then, in the autumn of 1918, the world he had been preparing to inherit collapsed. The armistice came like a verdict delivered in a language he could not yet translate. Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield, the newspapers and returning soldiers insisted. It had been betrayed from within. In Munich the streets filled with new crowds, not cheering this time but arguing, chanting, sometimes fighting. Red flags appeared where the old imperial colors had flown. For a few chaotic weeks a revolutionary government claimed power in Bavaria. Heinrich walked through those streets with his heart hammering. He saw men his father's age shouting that everything must be torn down. He saw soldiers with empty sleeves and hollow eyes who had come home to a country that no longer seemed to want them. He felt, in his chest and in his stomach, the same sickening lurch he had felt as a smaller child when illness kept him from joining the other boys. Only now the weakness was not his alone. It belonged to Germany itself. In the family apartment the silence was heavier than any argument. His father sat for long stretches without speaking, the newspaper folded on his knee, his eyes fixed on nothing. His mother kept the routines of cooking and cleaning, but her hands moved more slowly, and sometimes she paused at the window as if listening for news that had not yet arrived. Heinrich retreated to his room and opened his diary. He wrote that the nation had been poisoned by division, by softness, by people who had forgotten what it meant to belong to something larger than themselves. He did not yet have the words for the conclusions he was reaching, but the shape of them was already forming. If Germany was to live, it would need men who refused to be weak, men who could impose order on chaos, who could draw hard lines between who belonged and who did not, who could make the country strong again by whatever means proved necessary. He began to read differently after that. The old heroic tales were no longer enough. He sought out newer writings that spoke of blood and soil, of a German people whose strength had been diluted by outsiders and internal traitors. The ideas did not arrive as sudden revelations. They arrived as answers to questions he had been asking since he was small. Why did his body feel like an enemy? Why did his country feel the same way? What would it take to make both of them whole? In those pages he found a promise that felt personal. Strength was not a gift. It was a decision, repeated every day, to harden what was soft and to purify what was mixed. Belonging was not something you inherited. It was something you proved by standing with the right people against the wrong ones. He was still only a young man in his early 20s when these thoughts settled into conviction. He had not yet joined any political party or worn any uniform. He was still the pale, serious son of a schoolteacher, still keeping his meticulous diary, still trying to master the body that had always seemed to lag behind his ambitions. But the hunger had found its shape. The boy who had once dreamed of knights now believed that Germany needed a new order of men, disciplined, loyal, ruthless when necessary, who would restore what had been lost and make sure it could never be lost again. He did not yet know where that belief would lead him. He only knew that the old stories and the new humiliations had pointed him in the same direction, and that he was finally ready to walk it. Just as that young Heinrich reached for stories and symbols of heroism to fill the emptiness left by his own frailty and his nation's defeat, many of us today look for ways to connect with the real history of courage that ultimately pushed back the darkness he would help create. If you find meaning in holding a piece of that past or watching its stories unfold, there are places where you can explore curated collections of World War II historical memorabilia and powerful documentaries available on Amazon. Or settle in with the gripping film Midway on Prime Video, which honors the bravery of those who fought across another ocean in the same global struggle. These are not just things to own or watch. They are ways to remember what real strength looked like when everything was at stake. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. And yet for Heinrich Himmler, the stories never led to humility or remembrance. They led to a colder certainty that only absolute discipline and absolute purity could protect Germany from ever feeling weak again. The pale boy who had lain awake imagining nights was already learning to see the world in harder terms. In the years just ahead, he would take that certainty into the political chaos of the early 1920s, searching for the movement and the leader who could turn private longing into public power. What he would become once he found them is the story that waits for us next. But we cannot understand the man in the black uniform until we have first understood the boy who believed that strength was something you seized because the world had never given it to you freely. That belief, born in a quiet Munich room amid illness and national shame, would one day echo through the lives of millions who never had the chance to write their own stories at all. In the crowded lecture halls and muddy fields around Munich in the early 1920s, a quiet young man with ink-stained fingers and a notebook always tucked in his pocket began trading the lonely dreams of his childhood for something sharper and more dangerous. The promise that he could finally belong to a cause that would make Germany strong again by any means necessary. Heinrich Himmler had left the family apartment in Munich carrying the same careful habits that had shaped his boyhood. He still rose early. He still filled pages with neat observations about his own conduct and the state of the world. But now those pages carried a new urgency. The national humiliation he had felt so deeply in 1918 had not faded with time. It had settled into something harder, something that made ordinary student life feel small and pointless. At the university he chose to study agriculture, not because he loved farming in any romantic sense, but because the subject seemed to promise a practical path back to the land, back to the blood and soil connection he had read about in the books that had comforted him as a sick child. In lectures about crop rotation and animal husbandry he sat near the front, taking meticulous notes while other young men laughed or argued about politics in the corridors. He told himself this discipline was preparation. Germany needed men who understood the earth, men who could rebuild what had been lost from the ground up. Yet the university itself felt like another place where he did not quite fit. He was still pale, still smaller than most of his peers, still the one who preferred the library to the beer cellars where students gathered to drink and fight. In those noisy rooms he sometimes lingered at the edges, listening to heated debates about the treaty that had crippled Germany, about the politicians who had signed it, about the communists and socialists who seemed determined to finish the job of destroying the nation from within. The anger in those voices stirred something in him. He recognized it as the same anger he had felt walking the streets in 1918. But here, among these young men, that anger had a shape. It had names and targets. And it offered a kind of fellowship he had never quite found before. It was in those same years that he first encountered the Ardaman movement, a loose network of young people who believed the salvation of Germany lay in returning to the land and rejecting the corrupt cities. They spoke of physical labor as purification, of living simply on farms, of building a new German community free from what they called foreign influences and racial mixing. For Heinrich the appeal was immediate and deeply personal. Here was a group that took seriously the ideas he had been turning over in his diary for years, the need for strength through discipline, the romance of the German past, the conviction that the nation's weakness came from dilution and betrayal. He joined their gatherings, sometimes traveling to rural estates where members worked the fields together during the day and sat around evening fires discussing the future. The physical work left his muscles aching in a way that felt honest, almost cleansing. For the first time in his life his body was being used for something larger than his own survival. When he wrote home to his parents he described these experiences with a quiet pride, framing them as a necessary hardening, a step toward the man he was determined to become. The emotional pull went deeper than the work. In the Ardaman circle he found something he had always craved without being able to name it, a sense of brotherhood that did not require him to be loud or athletic or naturally charismatic. What mattered was commitment. What mattered was sharing the same vision of a purified Germany. Around those fires he listened to stories of ancient tribes defending their soil and modern men willing to fight for it again. He began to see his own life as part of a larger story, one in which personal weakness could be overcome by collective purpose. The notebooks he carried grew thicker. He recorded not only his daily routines but his growing certainty that Germany's enemies were not just foreign powers but internal ones, people who had forgotten what it meant to belong to a single, strong folk. These entries were not yet the writings of a political operative. They were the private reflections of a young man who had finally found a language for the loneliness and the hunger that had followed him since childhood. Outside the farms and lecture halls, the streets of Munich and other Bavarian towns were becoming battlegrounds. Political gangs clashed almost nightly. Communists and nationalists fought with fists, clubs, and sometimes guns. Returning soldiers who felt abandoned by the Republic joined paramilitary groups that promised action and revenge. Heinrich watched these clashes with a mixture of fascination and unease. He saw young men like himself, some no older than he was, choosing sides and throwing themselves into the violence as if it were the only way to matter. The chaos frightened him, but it also confirmed what he already believed, that weakness invited attack, and that only strength, organized and unapologetic, could restore order. He began to move closer to the edges of these conflicts, not yet fighting but observing, taking mental notes the way he once took notes in his school books. The atmosphere of those streets, the shouted slogans, the sudden running crowds, the smell of smoke and sweat and fear, seeped into him. It taught him that ideas alone were not enough. Ideas needed bodies willing to defend them. In the autumn of 1923, the tension reached a breaking point. A new political movement led by a man named Adolf Hitler had been gaining attention in Munich with fiery speeches that named the betrayers and promised a rebirth of German greatness. Heinrich had heard the name before, had even read some of the pamphlets. The message felt familiar, like an amplification of everything he had been writing in his own notebooks. When the call came for supporters to gather in support of a bold action against the government in Berlin, he did not hesitate long. The decision to join the National Socialist German Workers' Party that year was not a dramatic conversion on a single night. It was the quiet culmination of years of searching. Signing his name on the membership roll felt, in his private thoughts, like finally stepping through a door he had been circling for a long time. Here was an organization that combined the romantic nationalism of the Ardaman movement with the hard political will he had seen lacking in so many other groups. Here was a leader who spoke with the certainty of someone who understood that Germany needed more than words. The night of the beer hall putsch unfolded in a blur of adrenaline and confusion that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He was not at the center of the planning. He was one of many young men who had answered the call, moving through the streets with a mixture of excitement and fear as the attempted seizure of power began. In the crowded beer hall where Hitler made his dramatic entrance, Heinrich felt the electric charge of hundreds of men united in a single, reckless purpose. When the march toward the city center began, he walked among them, heart-pounding, convinced in that moment that history was turning. The sudden eruption of gunfire shattered the certainty. Men fell. The column broke. What had felt like the beginning of a triumphant march became a panicked retreat. In the chaos, Heinrich experienced the sharp edge of disappointment mixed with something more stubborn, a refusal to believe that the cause itself had failed. The putsch collapsed within hours. Hitler was arrested. Many of the participants scattered or were taken into custody. Heinrich, still near the edges of the action, managed to slip away, but the taste of that night stayed with him. In the days and weeks that followed, he returned to his notebooks with a new intensity. He wrote about the need for better organization, for tighter loyalty, for men who would not break when the first shots were fired. The failure did not shake his faith. It deepened it. He told himself that the revolution had simply come too soon, that the movement needed more time to prepare, more men who understood that strength required patience as well as courage. The emotional consequence was a hardening of resolve. The loneliness he had carried for so long was now wrapped inside a larger identity. He was no longer just a pale student trying to prove himself to his father or to his own body. He was part of something that had already shown it was willing to risk everything. That knowledge brought a strange kind of comfort even as it pulled him further from the ordinary life his parents still hoped he would lead. Letters home became more guarded. He wrote of his studies and his work on the land, but he said little about the political meetings or the night of the putsch. When his mother wrote back with gentle questions about his health and his plans, he answered politely but felt the growing distance between the careful son they remembered and the man he was becoming in secret. The notebooks recorded that distance too. Page after page filled with reflections on duty, on the necessity of sacrifice, on the enemies who would stop at nothing to keep Germany weak. The handwriting remained neat, but the language grew sharper. He was learning, in the quiet hours after political gatherings and failed uprisings, that belonging to a revolution exacted a price. It asked you to set aside the softer parts of yourself, the part that still wanted his father's approval, the part that still feared his own frailty, and to replace them with something colder and more certain. The atmosphere that surrounded him during those years was one of constant low-level war. Ordinary streets in Munich could turn into running battles between rival groups at any hour. Beer halls that had once hosted students singing folk songs now hosted speeches that ended with men pouring into the night ready to fight. The Ardaman farms offered a temporary escape into physical labor and ideological purity, but even there the conversations circled back to the same questions: who truly belonged in the new Germany? What would it take to remove those who did not? Heinrich absorbed these questions as if they were his own. He saw in them a way to make sense of everything that had ever made him feel small. The radicalization was not a single dramatic moment. It was the slow accumulation of nights spent listening, days spent working beside men who shared his hunger, and private hours spent writing in notebooks that no one else would read. Each entry, each conversation, each glimpse of street violence pulled him a little further from the boy who had once dreamed only of nights and a little closer to the man who would one day believe that building an empire required the willingness to burn the old world down. Just as that young man's convictions were being forged in the charged atmosphere of political street violence, secret oaths, and the heady sense of belonging to something larger than himself, many of us today want to understand how ordinary places and ordinary people can be swept into such currents. Seeing the raw visual evidence of how those streets actually looked, the crowds, the clashes, the charged meetings, helps us grasp the emotional and physical reality that made radicalization feel not only possible but necessary to men like him. That is why I have partnered with a collection that makes available rare and censored photographs, documents, and footage from that era and the years that followed, material too graphic or restricted for us to show here, but essential for anyone who wants to confront the full, unfiltered record of how such movements took root. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. In the months after the putsch's failure, Heinrich Himmler did not retreat from the ideas that had drawn him in. He moved deeper into them. The notebooks continued to fill. The search for a place where his particular combination of meticulousness, loyalty, and hunger for strength could be put to use continued as well. He was still the quiet, serious young man his family had always known, but something fundamental had shifted. The revolution had not succeeded in 1923, yet it had succeeded in claiming him. He now understood, in a way he had not before, that the work of rebuilding Germany would require more than speeches or farm labor. It would require organization, discipline, and men willing to do whatever the cause demanded. That understanding would guide every choice he made in the years ahead. The boy who had once lain awake imagining himself as a hero had become a devotee of a movement that promised to make heroes of ordinary men, if they were willing to pay the price. And Heinrich Himmler had already decided that he was. What he would do with that decision, and how far he would carry it, is the story that waits for us next. In the back rooms and smoky meeting halls of a struggling political movement still reeling from its own failed gamble for power, a quiet young man with neat handwriting and an almost invisible presence began to understand that real influence often belonged to those willing to do the patient, unseen work that louder men overlooked. Heinrich Himmler had not emerged from the wreckage of the 1923 putsch as a celebrated figure. He had slipped away from the chaos with the same careful instinct for self-preservation that had kept him on the edges of the violence. In the months that followed, while some of his new comrades scattered or went into hiding, he returned to the slow, unglamorous tasks that the movement still needed. He wrote letters. He organized small gatherings. He carried messages between men who no longer trusted one another. The failure had taught him something important. Revolutions did not succeed on passion alone. They required people who could keep records straight, who could make sure the right words reached the right ears, who could turn scattered anger into something that resembled order. He discovered he was good at these things. More than good, he found a quiet satisfaction in them that he had rarely felt before. The Nazi Party in those years was not yet the disciplined machine it would later become. It was a loose collection of ambitious men, local rivalries, and competing visions, held together mostly by the growing legend of Adolf Hitler. After his release from prison, Hitler was rebuilding carefully, testing which allies he could trust and which ones he needed to watch. Heinrich watched all of this from a distance at first, still the same pale, serious young man who preferred his notebooks to the beer halls where others argued late into the night. He continued his agricultural studies when money allowed and took whatever small jobs came his way, but his real energy went into the party work. He wrote reports on local activities, compiled lists of reliable contacts, and made sure that when instructions came down from above, they were carried out without unnecessary drama. These were not the tasks that brought applause or newspaper headlines. They were the tasks that kept fragile organizations from falling apart. It was during this period that he first came into closer contact with Gregor Strasser, one of the party's most energetic organizers in northern Germany. Strasser needed dependable men who could travel, write clearly, and handle the endless administrative details that came with trying to build a national movement out of regional resentments. Heinrich fit the description perfectly. He was not charismatic. He did not command rooms with his presence. But he could be counted on to deliver a message on time, to remember a name correctly, and to keep his own opinions to himself unless asked. In the letters he sent back and forth during these years, a picture emerges of a young man who was learning the geography of power not through bold speeches but through the steady accumulation of small favors and reliable service. He began to understand that in a movement full of larger-than-life personalities, the person who could be trusted with the quiet work often ended up holding more real influence than anyone expected. The first time he met Adolf Hitler in person left a mark he would carry for the rest of his life. It was not a long conversation, and Heinrich was not the center of it. He had been sent with documents or instructions, one of several men waiting in an anteroom while Hitler spoke with others. When his turn came, he stood straight, spoke clearly, and answered the questions put to him without hesitation or unnecessary words. What stayed with him afterward was not any particular praise, there was little of that, but the sense that he had been seen. Hitler had looked at him, listened to him, and accepted his service without question. For a man who had spent most of his life feeling overlooked or underestimated, that simple acknowledgement carried enormous weight. In the privacy of his own thoughts, and later in the pages of his notebooks, Heinrich began to frame his role differently. He was not merely helping a political party survive. He was offering his particular gifts, his capacity for order, his willingness to remain in the background, his absolute loyalty, to a leader who might one day need exactly those qualities. By the late 1920s the party was growing again, though still far from the force it would become. Rivalries between different factions remained sharp. Strasser represented one vision, more focused on socialist-sounding economic ideas and northern strength, while others clustered closer to Hitler's own circle in Munich. Heinrich navigated these currents without ever appearing to take sides. He continued to do the work that needed doing, traveling when asked, writing the reports that kept distant groups connected, making sure that the small protective squads the party relied on for rallies and meetings remained disciplined and loyal. These squads were still tiny, almost afterthoughts compared with the larger street-fighting groups of the time. They existed mainly to guard speakers and maintain order at events. Most men saw them as secondary. Heinrich saw something else. He saw the beginning of an instrument that could be shaped into something far more precise and reliable than the noisy, unpredictable gangs that dominated the streets. The moment his patient work was recognized came in 1929, when Hitler appointed him to lead those small protective squads. The organization was still called the Schutzstaffel, or SS, and at the time it numbered only a few hundred men at most. To many in the party it seemed like a minor posting, almost an administrative afterthought. To Heinrich it felt like validation of everything he had been doing quietly for years. He was being given the chance to build something from almost nothing, to turn a loose collection of bodyguards into a force defined by loyalty, discipline, and personal devotion to Hitler himself. In the letters he wrote around this time, and in the private reflections he recorded, there is a sense of quiet satisfaction rather than triumph. He did not boast. He simply began the work of turning an idea into reality. He started with the small things that had always mattered to him. He tightened the requirements for membership. He insisted on neatness, on punctuality, on the kind of personal conduct that reflected well on the movement even when no one was watching. He wrote circulars and instructions that emphasized absolute obedience to the Führer above all local loyalties or personal ambitions. These were not dramatic reforms announced in public speeches. They were the steady, almost invisible adjustments that slowly changed the character of the small organization he had been given. Men who joined the SS under his early leadership began to understand that they were expected to be different from the rowdier elements in other groups. They were to be reliable, self-controlled, and utterly devoted to one man. Heinrich understood, perhaps better than most, that in a movement built on charisma and emotion, the real power often belonged to whoever could translate that emotion into lasting structure. The emotional texture of these years was complicated. He was still the same man who had once felt physically weak and socially invisible. That sense of inadequacy never entirely left him. But it was now channeled into something larger. Every successful report delivered, every small unit organized, every letter answered promptly became proof that he could matter without needing to be the loudest voice in the room. There were moments of private doubt, times when he wondered whether the movement would ever achieve the national rebirth he had come to believe was necessary. Those doubts were usually followed by renewed effort. He worked longer hours. He traveled more. He made sure that when Hitler or Strasser needed something done quietly, it was done without fanfare or failure. The satisfaction he felt was not public recognition. It was the private knowledge that he was becoming indispensable in ways that few people noticed. His personal life during these years reflected the same pattern of quiet discipline. He married Margaret Bowden in 1928, a woman several years older than he was, and the marriage brought a measure of stability to his days. Yet even in his private correspondence the dominant theme remained his work for the party. The movement had become the central fact of his existence, the place where his particular combination of meticulousness and ambition could finally find expression. He wrote to his parents less frequently now, and when he did the letters were polite but distant, filled with reassurances about his health and his prospects while revealing little of the inner world he shared only with his notebooks and his closest party contacts. What he was building, piece by piece, was not yet the vast apparatus it would become. In 1929 the SS was still a small, almost insignificant part of a larger and still fragile political movement. But Heinrich had already begun to see its potential in ways that others did not. He understood that loyalty could be cultivated, that discipline could be taught, and that an organization built on personal devotion to a single leader could eventually become more powerful than groups that relied on noise and numbers alone. He did not speak of these thoughts publicly. He simply continued the patient work of turning a handful of men into the beginning of something more. The real work of preserving these stories, the patient hours spent in archives, the careful reading of letters and diaries, the effort to understand how an unassuming man could rise through loyalty and paperwork rather than charisma, happens long after the dramatic events have ended. If the history we are exploring together has moved you, and if you believe in keeping these warnings alive for new generations, a small tip on Ko-Fi, even as little as $1, helps support the research and time that go into crafting these narratives with the depth they deserve. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. In the years immediately after that 1929 appointment, Heinrich Himmler continued to work in the same methodical way, expanding the SS one careful decision at a time. He was still the quiet man in the background, the one who stayed late to finish reports while others celebrated or argued. But the foundation he was laying would prove far more durable than anyone around him yet realized. The unseen hand was already at work, shaping something that would one day operate in the shadows of an entire nation. What that organization would become, and how far its reach would eventually extend, depended on forces far larger than any single man's ambition. Yet the character of what was being built already bore the unmistakable imprint of the man who had been given the chance to build it. The boy who had once dreamed of strength was now learning that real power often belonged to those patient enough to claim it through loyalty, through order, and through the quiet accumulation of influence that others were too impatient to pursue. That lesson would guide every step he took next. In a modest office filled with the scent of paper and ink, a man who had spent his life feeling overlooked began to build something that would one day demand the loyalty of thousands, not through noise or force, but through the careful selection of men who shared his vision of an unbreakable order. Heinrich Himmler had been given command of a small protective squad that most in the movement still treated as an afterthought. Yet in the early years of the new decade he approached the task with the same quiet intensity he had once brought to his school notebooks and farm work. He believed the men under his charge could become more than bodyguards. They could become the living embodiment of everything he had come to value: discipline over chaos, loyalty over ambition, and a shared sense of purpose that went deeper than political slogans. In his private thoughts he began to speak of them as the beginning of a new order, something closer to the knightly brotherhoods he had read about as a boy than to the rough street fighters who dominated other parts of the movement. The work started with people. He reviewed applications himself whenever he could, studying photographs and personal histories with the same care a craftsman might give to selecting wood for a fine instrument. He wanted men who looked a certain way, tall enough, strong enough, with features that matched the ideal he carried in his mind. But he wanted something more than appearance. He wanted proof of ancestry, of generations rooted in the soil of Germany, free from what he considered foreign contamination. And above all, he wanted evidence of absolute devotion to Adolf Hitler. These were not abstract requirements written by distant bureaucrats. They were personal standards he enforced because he believed the strength of the entire enterprise depended on the purity of its human material. When a candidate was accepted, the news was delivered with a sense of ceremony. When one was turned away, the rejection carried the quiet finality of a door closing on a future that would never be. The men who joined felt the difference immediately. Many came from backgrounds similar to his own, middle-class families, modest educations, a lingering sense that the world had not yet recognized their worth. In the SS they found something the larger movement often lacked: a sense of belonging that felt almost familial. They wore the same black uniforms, swore the same oaths, and participated in ceremonies that marked them as different from the ordinary party member. There were quiet rituals around marriage, for example, where couples pledged themselves not only to each other but to the future of the racial community. These moments were intimate and serious, conducted with a gravity that made participants feel they were part of something larger than any single life. Heinrich took satisfaction in these details. He saw them as the living expression of an ideal he had carried since childhood, the belief that strength came from order, and that order could be built one carefully chosen person at a time. The emotional texture of this work was complex for him. He still carried the private awareness of his own physical limitations, the memory of a body that had never matched the heroic images in his books. Yet here, in the creation of this new order, he found a way to transcend those limitations. He did not need to be the strongest or the most charismatic man in the room. He needed only to be the one who understood what the order required and had the patience to shape it. When he spoke to groups of new recruits, his voice was calm and measured. He told them they were not joining a political club or a street gang. They were entering a community bound by blood, by loyalty, and by the conviction that Germany's future depended on men like them remaining pure in body and in spirit. The men listened. Many of them had spent years searching for exactly this kind of certainty, and in Himmler's steady presence they found someone who seemed to offer it without the bluster they had grown tired of elsewhere. The contrast with the larger SA became sharper with each passing month. The SA was loud, visible, and often unruly, men who fought in the streets and celebrated their victories in beer halls. Heinrich viewed them with a mixture of wariness and quiet disdain. He believed their methods were too chaotic, their loyalty too easily swayed by local leaders rather than by the single figure at the top. In private conversations and in the instructions he circulated, he emphasized that the SS must remain separate, smaller, and more disciplined. The black uniform itself became a statement. It was not the brown of the SA. It was darker, more severe, designed to convey seriousness rather than revolutionary fervor. When SS men stood guard at rallies, they were expected to remain still and silent, a living wall of order rather than a shouting crowd. This distinction was not lost on the men themselves. Many took pride in being seen as the more reliable, more elite element. They began to carry themselves differently, with a quiet confidence that came from knowing they belonged to something stricter and, in their eyes, purer. Himmler's own commitment to this vision had the quality of a personal mission. He wrote circulars and guidelines that read almost like moral codes, stressing cleanliness of body and mind, the importance of family life conducted according to racial principles, and the absolute requirement of obedience to Hitler above all other considerations. These were not empty words to him. He believed with a near-religious intensity that the German people could be renewed only if the right men were placed in positions of trust and then bound together by rituals and symbols that reinforced their separation from the ordinary world. The SS runes, the death as head insignia, the ceremonies that marked promotions and marriages, all of these were tools in the creation of a new kind of man. He did not speak of these things in public speeches. He worked through the patient accumulation of rules, inspections, and personal example. When he visited SS units, he noticed small details, a man's posture, the condition of his uniform, the way he spoke about his duty. These observations fed back into the standards he set for everyone else. There were moments of private doubt. He knew the SS was still small and that many powerful figures in the movement viewed it as little more than Hitler's personal bodyguard. He understood that real influence would require more than symbols and selection criteria. Yet he also sensed that the very act of creating this distinct identity was already changing the balance of power inside the movement. Men who joined the SS began to see themselves as different, and that difference created loyalty that ran deeper than political convenience. Heinrich felt this loyalty directed toward himself as well as toward Hitler. He was the one who had defined the standards, who had welcomed them into the order, who had given their lives a shape and a purpose they had not found elsewhere. This recognition was quiet, rarely spoken aloud, but it sustained him through the long hours of administrative work. The human stories within this forging of the order were many and varied. There was the young man from a rural background who had felt invisible in the larger party but who now stood straighter because he wore the black uniform and carried the responsibility of guarding the movement's most Important figures. There was the married couple who participated in one of the new SS marriage ceremonies and afterward felt they had pledged themselves to something eternal rather than merely personal. There were also those who were turned away, the man whose ancestry papers contained a questionable name, the applicant whose physical measurements did not meet the ideal, and the quiet sting of exclusion that followed them. Heinrich did not dwell on these rejections in public, but he understood their emotional weight. He believed they were necessary for the larger good, yet he also knew that each one represented a life turned aside from the community he was building. By the middle of the decade, the SS had grown in both numbers and self-conception. It was still far smaller than the SA, but it carried a different atmosphere. Men spoke of it as an elite within the movement, a brotherhood bound by blood and by an oath that placed Hitler above every other loyalty. Heinrich watched this development with a mixture of pride and continued vigilance. He knew that symbols and rituals could inspire, but they could also become empty if the men inside them lost their discipline or their faith. He continued to insist on the small things, the neatness of reports, the promptness of responses, the personal conduct expected even when no superior was watching. These details mattered to him because he believed they were the true foundation of the order he was trying to create. Without them, the black uniforms and the ancient runes would be nothing more than costumes. The deliberate creation of an elite order bound by ideology and symbols gave men a sense of belonging that ordinary political membership could not provide, yet the full depth of those symbols, the private rituals, and the inner world they shaped is something many listeners want to explore further. If you would like to go deeper into the psychology of how such an order was built and what it meant to the men who joined it, our Patreon community offers extended conversations, raw visual material, and a space where we can examine these histories together without rushing past the human details. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. In the quiet hours after meetings or inspections, Heinrich Himmler often returned to his desk and continued the work that no one else saw. He wrote additional guidelines, reviewed personnel files, and thought about how to strengthen the bonds that held the SS together. He was still the same man who had once felt physically frail and socially invisible, but he had found a way to turn those old insecurities into the driving force behind something larger. The order he was forging was not yet tested by real power. It had not yet been asked to do the things that would later define its name in history. But the foundation was already in place, a group of men who believed they were different, who had sworn loyalty to one leader above all others, and who carried themselves with the quiet certainty that they were building the future rather than merely surviving the present. That certainty would soon be called upon in ways neither Heinrich nor the men around him could yet imagine. The forging of the order was complete enough to matter. What remained was to see how far that order would be allowed to reach when the moment for action finally arrived. On a summer night when old comrades suddenly became targets and the quiet knock on a door could mean the end of everything a man had built, a careful organizer who had spent years working in the shadows finally saw his chance to turn loyalty into lasting power. Heinrich Himmler had watched the tension between the SA and the rest of the movement grow for months. The SA had become enormous, loud, and increasingly difficult to control. Its leader, Ernst Röhm, spoke openly about the need for a second revolution, one that would go further than Hitler seemed willing to go. To many inside the SS, Röhm's ambitions felt like a direct threat to the disciplined order they had been trying to create. Himmler himself said little in public. He continued his methodical work, strengthening the bonds inside his own organization, making sure the men under his command understood that their first loyalty was to Hitler and to the standards he had set. Yet in private he understood that the SA size and its leaders' restlessness could not be ignored forever. The movement could not survive if it remained divided between the noisy street fighters and the quieter, more selective force he was shaping. The decision to act did not come from Himmler alone. It came from Hitler, who had grown weary of Röhm's demands and fearful that the SA's independence might one day challenge his own authority. When the order reached Himmler, it arrived with the weight of absolute necessity. He was to help eliminate the threat. The work would be carried out by the SS, the same men he had spent years selecting and training for loyalty and discipline. There was no room for hesitation. The men who had once marched together, who had shared the early struggles and the failed putsch, were now on opposite sides of a line that could not be uncrossed. Himmler felt the gravity of what was being asked. He had known Rome for years. They had been allies in the early days, bound by the same desire to see Germany rise again. Now that shared history had to be set aside. In the quiet hours before the operation began, he reviewed lists of names, considered who could be trusted and who might waver. He thought about the men who would have to carry out the arrests and, in some cases, the executions. These were not strangers. They were comrades who had sworn the same oaths, worn the same uniforms in the early years, and believed they were fighting for the same future. The personal cost of turning against them was real, even if it could not be spoken aloud. Himmler understood that the movement demanded this sacrifice. He also understood that his own position, and the future of the organization he had built, depended on carrying out the order without hesitation or mercy. The night unfolded in a series of swift, coordinated moves. Across several cities, SS units moved into hotels, apartments, and SA headquarters. Men were pulled from their beds, sometimes still half asleep, sometimes already sensing that something had gone terribly wrong. There were no long speeches or dramatic confrontations in most cases. There were only the sudden lights, the armed men at the door, and the realization that the world they had known had shifted in a single moment. Some accepted their fate with a kind of weary resignation, as if they had always known that loyalty in this movement could turn dangerous. Others protested, confused and angry, unable to believe that the comrades they had fought beside were now the ones coming to take them away. Himmler did not stand in the streets directing every action. He worked from a central point, receiving reports, confirming that orders were being followed, and making sure that nothing was left to chance. The efficiency of the operation reflected the years he had spent instilling discipline. The men who carried it out moved with a cold precision that came from training and from the belief that they were protecting something larger than any single friendship. Yet even in that efficiency there were human moments that could not be erased. A man who had once trained new recruits now found himself arresting one of his own former students. Another recognized a face from the early beer hall days and felt the brief, sharp pain of betrayal before pushing it aside. These small fractures in the human heart were real, even if they were not allowed to slow the work. The most painful confrontations were reserved for the highest targets. When Rome himself was taken, the moment carried the weight of a personal ending. He had been one of Hitler's earliest and most visible supporters, a man who had believed the revolution would continue until it remade every part of German society. Now he was being told that the revolution had decided it no longer needed him. The shock on his face, the disbelief that the leader he had followed could order his removal, spoke to something deeper than politics. It spoke to the way movements built on intense loyalty can consume even their strongest early bonds when power is at stake. Himmler knew this. He had watched it happen in smaller ways for years. Now it was happening on a scale that would change the entire movement. In the hours and days that followed, the fear spread through the ranks like a cold wind. Men who had once spoken freely about their ambitions began to measure their words. Anyone who had been close to Rome or who had expressed sympathy for the SA's more radical ideas suddenly found themselves under suspicion. The SS had proven it could act quickly and without mercy when ordered. That proof changed the atmosphere inside the movement more effectively than any speech could have done. Loyalty was no longer simply a matter of shared ideas. It was now a matter of survival. Those who had doubted or hesitated understood that the cost of being on the wrong side could be final. Himmler felt the shift in his own position almost immediately. The operation had elevated the SS from a small protective force into something far more significant. It had demonstrated that the organization could be trusted with the most sensitive and dangerous tasks. More importantly, it had removed the greatest rival to its independence. The SA would never again hold the same power. The path was now clearer for the kind of disciplined, ideologically pure force Himmler had been trying to create. He did not celebrate openly. He returned to his work with the same quiet focus, but those who knew him noticed a new confidence. The man who had once worked in the background now carried the knowledge that his organization had helped decide the future direction of the entire movement. The human cost extended beyond the men who were taken that night. Families received the news in fragments, sometimes a brief official notice, sometimes nothing at all. Wives and children were left to piece together what had happened, to live with the sudden absence and the unspoken fear that asking too many questions could bring the same fate to their door. These quiet aftershocks were part of the operation's real power. It did not simply remove political opponents. It created an atmosphere in which everyone understood that the rules had changed and that personal loyalty to the leader now outweighed every other bond. Himmler understood this atmosphere better than most. He had spent years building an organization that valued loyalty above all else. The Purge had tested that value in the most extreme way possible. The men who had carried out the orders had proven they could set aside personal feelings when the movement required it. That proof strengthened the SS in his eyes. It also deepened his own conviction that the order he was shaping had to remain separate from the chaos of ordinary politics. The black uniforms, the strict selection, the rituals of belonging, all of these now served a clearer purpose. They marked men who could be trusted to do what was necessary, even when it meant turning against people they had once called comrades. In the weeks that followed, Himmler moved to consolidate what had been gained. He made sure the SS remained disciplined and focused. He continued to emphasize that their loyalty was personal and absolute. The experience of the Purge had shown him that power could shift quickly when old alliances broke. He was determined that the organization he led would never be caught on the wrong side of such a shift again. The work was still quiet, still methodical, but it now carried the weight of demonstrated capability. Men who had once viewed the SS as secondary began to treat it with new respect, and sometimes with new fear. The secret planning and sudden violence of that night were not isolated events. They belonged to a much larger pattern of hidden decisions and swift actions that would continue to shape the course of the coming years. If you want to understand how such operations worked across the entire conflict, how small groups of men in back rooms could alter the fate of nations, I invite you to sign up for our free email newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive the powerful ebook The Shadow War, 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II, along with weekly deep dive articles that uncover forgotten stories of espionage, resistance, and the hidden battles that decided the outcome of the war. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. For Heinrich Himmler, the night when knives moved in the dark marked the moment his long, patient work finally produced visible results. The SS had proven it could act with speed and precision when the moment demanded it. The movement had been reshaped, rivals removed, and a clearer path opened for the kind of elite force he had always believed Germany needed. Yet the human price of that clarity remained. Friendships had ended. Trust had been broken in ways that could never be fully repaired. And the quiet man who had once felt overlooked now carried the knowledge that he had helped decide who would live and who would disappear into the night. That knowledge would stay with him as the organization he had forged moved into the next phase of its existence, stronger, more certain, and already beginning to cast a longer shadow over everything it touched. The destiny he had seized was real, but it had come at a cost that would continue to reveal itself in the years ahead. In the months after the night when knives moved in the dark, a new kind of silence began to settle over Germany, not the silence of peace, but the careful quiet of people who had learned that even a casual word spoken at the wrong moment could bring the state to their door. Heinrich Himmler understood that real power did not always announce itself with marches or speeches. Sometimes it arrived in the form of a file folder placed on a desk, or a new set of instructions that slowly changed how ordinary men and women lived their daily lives. After the events that had removed his greatest rival inside the movement, he turned his attention to something quieter but far more lasting: the police. The Prussian Gestapo had already existed under another man's control, but Himmler saw in it the possibility of something much larger, an instrument that could reach into homes, workplaces, and private conversations without ever needing to raise its voice. He moved carefully, using the same methodical patience that had shaped the SS. He did not demand everything at once. He asked for authority over political policing, and when it was granted, he placed his most trusted deputy, Reinhard Heydrich, in charge of turning that authority into a living system. Heydrich was different from Himmler in almost every visible way: taller, colder, more openly ambitious, but the two men shared a common belief that loyalty could be manufactured and that fear, properly organized, could become a form of governance. Together they began to build the SD, the security service that would gather information not through dramatic raids but through the steady accumulation of reports from neighbors, colleagues, and even family members who had learned that silence was safer than speaking. The Gestapo itself remained small in numbers compared with the population it watched, yet its reach grew because ordinary people began to police themselves. A shopkeeper who once complained about prices now thought twice before saying anything that might be repeated. A teacher who had once discussed politics openly with colleagues began to keep his opinions to himself. These small changes did not happen overnight. They accumulated the way dust settles on furniture, almost unnoticed until one day the room feels different. Himmler took satisfaction in this gradual transformation. He believed that a truly strong state did not need to arrest everyone who disagreed with it. It only needed to make disagreement feel dangerous and lonely. In the early concentration camps that appeared in those same years, he saw another tool for the same purpose. These were not yet the vast extermination centers that would come later. There were places where political opponents, trade unionists, and anyone labeled unreliable could be sent without trial, held for months or years, and then released broken or compliant. The men and women who returned from those camps rarely spoke of what they had seen. Their silence became another thread in the web. Families learned to accept that a loved one might disappear for a time and that asking too many questions could bring the same fate to the rest of the household. The camps did not need to be everywhere to be effective. Their existence, combined with the knowledge that anyone could be sent there on the word of an informant, was enough to change the atmosphere of an entire country. Consider the experience of an ordinary family in a provincial town. The father had once been active in a trade union. After the political changes, he kept his head down and tried to provide for his wife and 2 children by working quietly at his trade. One evening there was a knock at the door. 2 men in plain clothes asked him to come with them for questioning. They did not raise their voices. They showed no anger. They simply said the matter would be cleared up quickly. The wife stood in the doorway holding their youngest child and watched her husband walk down the street between the 2 men. She did not scream or protest. She had already learned that scenes only made things worse. For weeks she heard nothing. Neighbors stopped visiting. Some crossed the street when they saw her. When her husband finally returned, he was thinner, quieter, and unwilling to speak about where he had been. He went back to work the next day as if nothing had happened. The family never discussed that night again. The children grew up understanding that certain subjects were never to be mentioned at the dinner table. That understanding was the real victory of the system Himmler was helping to create. Himmler himself rarely visited the camps or the interrogation rooms. He worked through reports, through meetings with Heydrich, through the steady expansion of rules that gave the police broader powers to act without judicial oversight. He saw his role as that of an architect rather than an executioner. He wanted a Germany in which every citizen understood, without needing to be told, that certain thoughts and certain associations were simply not possible anymore. The SD's network of informants made this possible. A man might be denounced by a coworker who wanted his job, or by a neighbor who resented his success, or even by a family member who feared being tarred by association. The Gestapo did not need to investigate every report thoroughly. The fact that an investigation could begin at any time was usually enough. People began to live as if they were already being watched, which meant they policed their own words and the words of those around them. There were small moments of resistance that revealed how much had already changed. A woman might quietly burn letters from a relative who had emigrated rather than risk having them found. A group of friends might agree never to discuss politics when they met for coffee, even though they had once talked freely. These acts were not heroic in the dramatic sense. They were the everyday accommodations people made when they realized that the state had found a way to listen without being in the room. Himmler understood the power of these accommodations. He believed they proved that the German people were learning the discipline he had always considered necessary. In his own correspondence and in the private notes he kept, he expressed satisfaction that order was being restored not through constant violence but through the patient work of institutions that made violence unnecessary most of the time. The unification of the police forces under his command in the mid-1930s completed the structure he had been building. No longer would different regions or different branches of law enforcement operate according to their own rules. Everything that touched on political reliability, on racial purity, on loyalty to the leadership now flowed through channels he controlled. This did not mean that every police officer became a political operative overnight. Most continued to do the ordinary work of keeping streets safe and solving ordinary crimes. But the possibility that any investigation could suddenly become political hung over the entire system. A traffic stop could lead to questions about a man's political background. A domestic dispute could result in one spouse being questioned about the other's loyalty. The boundary between private life and state interest had been deliberately blurred. And Himmler saw this blurring as progress toward the kind of society he had imagined since he was a young man searching for strength and belonging. The emotional cost of living inside this web was felt most clearly by those who tried to maintain some private space. A father might tell his children to be careful what they said at school, not because he feared they would betray him, but because he knew children repeated things without understanding the danger. A mother might stop writing to a sister who lived abroad because she had heard that letters could be opened. These were not dramatic acts of heroism or cowardice. They were the small, daily calculations that people made when they realized the state had found a way to make fear feel normal. Himmler did not need every citizen to love the new order. He only needed them to behave as if they did. The Gestapo and the SD made that behavior feel like the only reasonable choice. What made the system especially effective was its impersonality. The knock on the door rarely came from someone filled with personal hatred. It came from men doing their job, following procedures that had been written in offices far away. This bureaucratic quality allowed ordinary people to participate in the tightening of the web without feeling they were doing anything extraordinary. A clerk who filed a report was simply doing paperwork. A neighbor who mentioned a suspicious conversation was simply being a good citizen. The machinery ran on these small, unremarkable actions, and because they were small and unremarkable, they became easier to repeat. Over time, the society that emerged was one in which trust between neighbors, between colleagues, and even between family members had been quietly eroded. Not destroyed entirely, people still fell in love, still helped one another in crises, still found moments of ordinary kindness, but always with the knowledge that those bonds could be tested at any moment by forces they could not see. Himmler took pride in this achievement because it matched the vision he had carried for so long. He had wanted an organization that could protect Germany from internal enemies without needing to rely on the chaotic violence of street fighters. The Gestapo and the SD, working together with the unified police, gave him exactly that. They operated in the background, gathering information, removing threats, and shaping behavior through the constant, low-level pressure of surveillance. The concentration camps served as the visible reminder of what could happen if someone stepped too far outside the lines. Most people never saw the inside of those camps, but everyone knew someone who had disappeared for a time. That knowledge was enough. The quiet, bureaucratic tightening of a police state that most citizens felt only as a gradual loss of freedom is something many of us want to understand more deeply. How ordinary days could feel increasingly constrained without any single dramatic event announcing the change. If you would like to absorb the full human texture of how it felt to live inside that slow shift, I highly recommend continuing your journey with a deeply researched audiobook on Audible. Comprehensive histories of the period or powerful survivor testimonies allow you to experience these stories through masterful narration while driving, walking, or simply having a quiet moment to reflect. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. For Heinrich Himmler, the creation of this silent web was not an end but a foundation. He had helped turn the police into an extension of the SS values, loyalty, racial purity, and the elimination of anything that threatened the order he believed Germany required. The system he helped build did not rely on constant terror. It relied on the more sustainable pressure of uncertainty and self-censorship. People learned to live within narrower boundaries because the cost of stepping outside them had become impossible to calculate. That narrowing of life was the real victory of the Gestapo police state. It did not need to arrest everyone who might one day cause trouble. It only needed to make the possibility of trouble feel ever-present and the price of safety feel like constant, quiet compliance. The web was now in place. What would be caught in it, and how far its strands would eventually reach, would become clear in the years that followed. But already the country had changed in ways that could not easily be reversed. The ordinary citizen who once spoke freely now measured every word. The family that once trusted its neighbors now kept its own counsel. And the man who had spent his life searching for a way to impose order on chaos had found, in the patient construction of this invisible machinery, a power more durable than any street battle or dramatic purge could ever have given him. In the quiet offices where family trees were examined like legal documents and the future of children was decided by the shape of a nose or the records of grandparents, a man who had once dreamed of heroic nights began to turn his vision of strength into something far more intimate and destructive, the careful sorting of human lives according to blood. Heinrich Himmler had always believed that Germany's renewal required more than political victories or police control. It required a transformation of the people themselves. The land and the blood that sprang from it had to be kept pure, protected from mixture and weakness. This was not an abstract theory for him. It was a deeply personal conviction shaped by years of reading, of private study, and of watching what he saw as the slow decline of a once strong nation. When he spoke of blood and soil, he meant it literally. The German people were, in his mind, a living organism that had been poisoned by foreign elements and by its own failure to guard its heritage. His task, as he understood it, was to become the careful gardener who would prune away what was weak and nurture what was strong. The SS became the instrument for this vision. Himmler insisted that the men who joined his organization could not simply swear loyalty to Hitler. They had to prove they were worthy of shaping the future. Marriage, the most personal of decisions, became a matter of state and racial inspection. An SS man who wished to marry had to submit detailed ancestry records for himself and his intended bride. Investigators traced family lines back generations, searching for any hint of Jewish blood, Slavic ancestry, or other traits considered undesirable. The process was bureaucratic and thorough. A young couple in love might wait months while clerks in distant offices pored over birth certificates and old church registers. Sometimes the answer came back positive, and the wedding could proceed with the full approval of the order. Other times the answer was no, delivered without emotion or appeal. The young woman who had dreamed of a life with the man she loved might suddenly find herself rejected, her future altered by lines on a piece of paper she would never see. The emotional weight of these decisions fell heaviest on those who were turned away. A man who had served faithfully in the SS might discover that his fiancée's grandmother had once lived in a region with mixed populations generations earlier. The relationship would end not because of any personal failing but because the bloodline had been judged impure. Families that had lived quietly for decades suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. A father might receive a letter informing him that his daughter's marriage application had been denied. He would sit at the kitchen table, the letter in his hands, trying to explain to his family why something that had once been a private joy had become a matter of official record. The shame was quiet but lasting. Neighbors might notice the absence of a wedding celebration. Friends might stop asking questions. The couple themselves would carry the rejection as a private wound, one that could not be discussed openly without risking further trouble. Himmler took a personal interest in these matters because he believed they were essential to the larger project. He reviewed some of the more difficult cases himself, convinced that only strict standards could protect the blood community he was trying to build. In his mind, this was not cruelty. It was necessary medicine for a nation that had grown soft and mixed. He wrote guidelines that emphasized the sacred duty of SS men to choose wives who would bear strong, healthy children of pure German stock. Ceremonies were held to mark these approved marriages, turning what had once been a personal milestone into a public affirmation of racial loyalty. The couples who participated often felt a genuine sense of pride. They believed they were part of something larger than themselves, contributing to the rebirth of their people through the most intimate act of all, the creation of new life. For them, the scrutiny felt like recognition rather than invasion. They had passed the test. They belonged. The same principles extended beyond marriage into the realm of reproduction itself. Programs were introduced to encourage families considered racially valuable to have more children while discouraging or preventing those judged unfit from having any at all. Early forced sterilization measures targeted individuals labeled as having hereditary defects, sometimes physical, sometimes mental, sometimes simply political or social. Doctors and officials worked together to identify candidates, and the procedures were carried out under the authority of the state. A young woman might be told that she was being sterilized for her own good and for the good of the nation. She might never fully understand the criteria that had been used against her. Her family would live with the knowledge that a future generation had been quietly erased by a decision made in an office far away. The loss was not always spoken of in dramatic terms. It appeared in the quiet grief of a mother who would never hold a grandchild, and the changed atmosphere of a household where hope for the future had been cut short without ceremony or explanation. Himmler saw these measures as part of a coherent whole. The land needed strong farmers rooted in the soil. The blood needed protection from dilution. The SS was to be both the guardian and the example. He encouraged his men to settle on the land when possible, to raise large families, and to see their personal lives as contributions to a national mission. In letters and internal circulars he returned again and again to the theme of duty, not just military or political duty, but the deeper duty to the generations yet unborn. He believed that a nation that failed to guard its blood would eventually disappear, no matter how many battles it won. This conviction gave his work a sense of urgency and moral certainty. He was not simply enforcing rules. He was, in his own estimation, saving Germany from a slow death by mixture and weakness. The human stories that emerged from this period reveal the full range of feeling that such policies produced. There was the young SS recruit who wrote home to his parents with pride after his marriage application was approved, describing the ceremony as a solemn vow not only to his wife but to the future of his people. There was the older couple whose son was denied permission to marry the woman he loved, and who sat in their living room struggling to comfort him while privately wondering whether their own family line carried some hidden flaw they had never suspected. There were the doctors and officials who carried out the sterilizations, some convinced they were performing a necessary service, others troubled by the human faces in front of them but unwilling to question the system that employed them. And there were the quiet acts of everyday resistance or accommodation, a family doctor who quietly advised a patient on how to avoid detection, a neighbor who chose not to report a questionable ancestry rumor, a mother who taught her children to keep certain family stories to themselves. These small choices mattered because they showed how ideology became lived experience. The cold language of racial science and hereditary health was translated into the most intimate decisions of ordinary lives. A young man's worth might now be measured not only by his courage or his skill, but by the shape of his skull or the records in a distant archive. A woman's value might be reduced to her ability to bear children of acceptable blood. The bureaucracy that made these judgments possible operated with a calm efficiency that made the process feel almost normal after a while. Forms were filled out. Medical examinations were conducted. Decisions were recorded. The human beings involved, those who decided and those who were decided upon, moved through the system one step at a time, often without ever seeing the full shape of what was being built. Himmler found deep personal satisfaction in this work. It aligned with the longing for order and strength that had driven him since boyhood. In creating rules that governed love, marriage, and reproduction, he was shaping the Germany he had always imagined, a nation of rooted, healthy, loyal people bound together by shared blood and shared soil. He did not see the exclusions and the sterilizations as acts of hatred. He saw them as acts of protection, necessary if the nation was to survive and thrive. This conviction allowed him to continue even when individual cases produced obvious suffering. The greater good, as he defined it, required sacrifices. And he was willing to ask those sacrifices of others because he believed he was asking them of himself as well. His own life was organized around the same principles of discipline and racial duty that he imposed on the SS. The broader society absorbed these changes in uneven ways. Some embraced the new emphasis on racial health and national renewal with genuine enthusiasm. Others complied out of fear or habit, learning to navigate the new rules without ever fully accepting them. Still others lived in the quiet dread of one day being measured and found wanting. The effect was cumulative. Over time, the idea that certain people were more valuable than others became embedded in daily life. It appeared in school lessons, in workplace conversations, and the way families planned for the future. The cold bureaucratic sorting of human beings according to racial ideology did not require constant violence to be effective. It required only that people accept, little by little, that their worth and their future could be decided by others according to standards they could not control or fully understand. Just as that quiet bureaucratic sorting turned the most personal decisions into matters of state record and racial judgment, many of us today look for ways to connect with the human reality behind such systems. Physical objects and visual storytelling from the era can help us grasp what these cold theories meant in the lives of real people. If you find yourself drawn to tangible reminders of this history, or if you want to honor the courage and sacrifice of those who stood against such darkness in every theater of the war, there are carefully curated collections of World War II historical memorabilia, books, and documentaries available on Amazon. You can also settle in with the powerful film Midway on Prime Video, which brings to life the determination of men fighting across the Pacific in the same global struggle. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. For Heinrich Himmler, the early years of building this racial framework were a period of steady, purposeful work. He was creating the conditions under which, he believed, a new and stronger Germany could take root. The SS would lead by example. Approved marriages would produce approved children. The land would be worked by those whose blood entitled them to it. The weak and the foreign would be gradually removed from the national body. He did not yet know how far this project would eventually be taken, or what it would cost in human suffering. He only knew that the vision felt necessary and right. The families whose futures were altered by a stamp on a form, the couples whose love was judged insufficiently pure, the individuals whose bodies were altered without their full consent. These were the necessary costs of renewal. Or so he told himself as he continued the patient, methodical labor of turning an ideology of blood into the lived reality of a nation. The foundation was being laid, one approved marriage and one denied future at a time. What would grow from that foundation would soon become visible to the world. There was a quiet office in Berlin where two very different men sat across from each other, one pale and meticulous, the other tall and coldly brilliant, and together they began to turn the simple act of listening into a weapon that could reach into any home without ever raising its voice. Heinrich Himmler had already proven he could build loyalty and discipline inside the SS. What he needed now was someone who could turn information itself into power. Reinhard Heydrich was that man. Tall, athletic, with sharp features and an even sharper mind, Heydrich carried himself with the confidence of someone who had once expected a brilliant career in the Navy only to find it cut short by a personal scandal. He arrived in Himmler's world carrying both ambition and a talent for organization that bordered on the ruthless. Where Himmler thought in terms of blood and soil and long-term racial renewal, Heydrich thought in terms of files, networks, and the precise application of pressure. Their partnership was not built on warmth. It was built on a shared understanding that the state could know everything about its citizens if only the right machinery was put in place. Himmler recognized immediately that Heydrich possessed the qualities he lacked. He could be charming when he needed to be, yet he could also be terrifyingly cold. He had a gift for making people talk and an even greater gift for making them afraid to remain silent. When Himmler placed him in charge of the SD, the security service of the SS, Heydrich began to construct something that had never quite existed before in Germany. An intelligence organization that did not simply react to threats but actively searched for them in advance. Informants were recruited in factories, universities, and apartment buildings. They were not always motivated by ideology. Some were paid. Some were blackmailed after small indiscretions were discovered. Others simply wanted to protect themselves by proving their usefulness. The information flowed upward through layers of handlers until it reached Heydrich's desk, where it was sorted, cross-referenced, and turned into files that could be used at any moment. The Gestapo, which Himmler had already brought under SS control, became the enforcement arm of this growing system. Under Heydrich's influence, it shed much of its earlier haphazard character. Arrests were no longer simply the result of street-level denunciations. They were often the result of careful accumulation of evidence over months. A man might receive a visit because his name had appeared in 3 separate reports from different informants. A woman might lose her job because a neighbor had mentioned her listening to foreign radio broadcasts. The machinery did not need to be loud to be effective. It worked best when it remained almost invisible, when people began to assume that someone, somewhere, already knew what they had said or done. Himmler and Heydrich met regularly. Their conversations were rarely about grand strategy. They were about the practical details of control. Heydrich would present reports on the mood in certain cities or the reliability of particular officials. Himmler would listen, ask quiet questions about loyalty and racial background, and then give his approval for the next step. There was a strange complementarity between them. Himmler brought the ideological certainty and the political protection that came from his direct line to Hitler. Heydrich brought the operational brilliance and the willingness to do whatever was necessary without hesitation or visible remorse. Together they created a system in which suspicion itself became a form of governance. No one needed to prove they were innocent. The burden was always on the individual to prove they were not a threat. Consider the experience of a mid-level civil servant in a government ministry. He had once been proud of his work and loyal to the state in the ordinary way most people are loyal. Then one day a colleague was arrested. The man had made a careless remark at a dinner party months earlier. The civil servant had been at that dinner. He had not reported the remark. Now he found himself called in for questioning. The interrogators were polite. They showed him the file that had been compiled on his colleague. They asked whether he had heard anything similar. They did not threaten him directly. They simply let him understand that his own file was already open and that its contents depended on how helpful he chose to be. He left the building shaken. That evening he sat at his kitchen table and told his wife they could no longer have certain friends over. He began to measure his words even in private. The change was not dramatic. It was simply the price of continuing to live as he had before. Over time he became one of the quiet informants the system relied upon. He never saw himself as a villain. He saw himself as someone who had learned to survive. Heinrich took a particular satisfaction in this kind of outcome. He understood that the most powerful form of control was the one that made people police themselves. He encouraged his officers to cultivate sources who could provide information not because they were forced to, but because they had come to believe that cooperation was the safest choice. Blackmail was a favorite tool. A compromising photograph, a record of an affair, a past political affiliation that could be twisted into something dangerous, these were collected and held in reserve. The threat of exposure was often more effective than arrest itself. People who knew their secrets were in someone else's hands tended to become very cooperative. They might report on colleagues, on neighbors, even on family members if the pressure was applied correctly. Himmler watched this development with a mixture of approval and a certain private distance. He approved of the results. The SD and the Gestapo were becoming the kind of precise instrument he had always wanted. Yet there were moments when even he seemed slightly unsettled by Heinrich's complete lack of visible emotion. Heinrich could discuss the destruction of a man's life over morning coffee with the same calm tone he used to discuss train schedules. Himmler, for all his ideological certainty, still carried some trace of the boy who had once kept careful notebooks about his own conduct. He believed in the necessity of what they were doing. He did not always enjoy watching how efficiently it could be done. The human cost accumulated in small, ordinary ways that rarely made headlines. A university student stopped attending certain lectures after learning that the professor had been questioned. A factory worker began to avoid conversations during breaks because he had noticed a new face among his colleagues who asked too many questions. A mother told her children never to repeat anything they heard at home. These were not acts of dramatic resistance or dramatic betrayal. They were the daily adjustments people made when they realized that the walls had ears and that those ears belonged to an organization that never forgot what it heard. The partnership between Himmler and Heinrich had created a state in which privacy itself had become a luxury that fewer and fewer people could afford. What made the system particularly insidious was its impersonality. Most citizens never met Heinrich or Himmler. They encountered the machinery through a local informant, a sudden visit from plainclothes men, or the quiet disappearance of someone they knew. The cruelty was calculated and bureaucratic. It was delivered by men who saw themselves as professionals doing necessary work. A Gestapo officer might go home to his family after a long day of interrogations and read bedtime stories to his children without any sense of contradiction. The separation between his professional self and his private self was maintained by the same logic that justified the entire system. Some people were threats, and threats had to be neutralized. The human beings on the other side of the desk were no longer fully human in the eyes of those who questioned them. They had become files, categories, potential dangers that needed to be managed. Himmler and Heinrich rarely spoke of these human costs in personal terms. Their conversation stayed focused on effectiveness and loyalty. Yet the partnership itself revealed something important about how such systems endure. Himmler provided the protective umbrella of ideological commitment and political access. Heinrich provided the operational engine that made the ideology function in the real world. Without Heinrich's cold efficiency, Himmler's vision might have remained largely theoretical. Without Himmler's political backing, Heinrich might have been seen as simply another ambitious policeman. Together they created something greater than either could have built alone. A machinery of surveillance and control that could operate with minimal direct violence because the threat of violence was always present and always invisible. The sophisticated, almost invisible machinery of surveillance and blackmail they perfected left behind a trail of files, photographs, and internal documents that reveal far more about the calculated nature of that cruelty than any summary could convey. If you want to confront the full, unfiltered visual record of how this system actually worked, the faces of those caught in it, the bureaucratic forms that decided their fates, the quiet offices where ordinary lives were dismantled, there is an exclusive digital collection available on Gumroad that brings together rare and censored photographs, documents, and footage from the SS and Gestapo era. This material is too graphic or restricted for us to show here, but it is essential for anyone who wants to understand the reality behind the machinery. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. In the years that followed, the partnership between these two men would continue to expand its reach. The SD grew into a vast intelligence network that extended beyond Germany's borders. The Gestapo became a byword for sudden, unexplained arrest. Ordinary citizens learned to live with the knowledge that their words and their associations were never entirely private. The human cost was measured not only in those who were arrested or ruined, but in the millions who learned to live smaller, quieter, more cautious lives. Himmler had found in Heydrich the perfect instrument for turning his vision of order into something that could actually be enforced at scale. Heydrich had found in Himmler the political protection that allowed his ambitions to flourish without limit. The result was a form of terror that did not always need to shout. It could simply wait, listen, and then act when the moment was right. That waiting and that listening would soon be tested on a far larger stage than either man had yet imagined. The silent web they had woven inside Germany was already reaching outward, ready to follow the advancing borders of the Reich wherever they might lead. When the German forces crossed the border into Poland, they did not arrive only as soldiers. They arrived with men who carried lists, orders, and a quiet conviction that entire categories of people had no right to remain where they stood. In the villages and towns that lay in the path of the advancing army, families woke to the sound of engines and the sight of uniforms they had only read about in newspapers. A Polish schoolteacher in a small town near the border heard the distant rumble and told his wife to gather their children's warm clothes. He had spent years teaching history and literature, believing that education could bridge differences between peoples. Now he stood at the window and felt the ground shift beneath everything he had trusted. His wife packed bread and a few photographs into a small bag while their daughter asked why they had to leave so suddenly. The father had no clear answer. He only knew that the world they had known was ending. Farther back, in the rear areas that the army had already secured, groups of men in black uniforms began their work. These were not ordinary soldiers. They had been selected and prepared for a different task. Many of them had joined the SS because it promised discipline, purpose, and a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. Some had read the same books Heinrich Himmler had once read as a young man, stories of ancient tribes defending their soil, of blood and heritage that needed protection. They had been told that Poland was not simply a country to be defeated. It was a land that needed to be cleansed so that German settlers could take root and grow strong. The orders they carried named specific groups: Polish intellectuals, priests, teachers, lawyers, and Jews. These people, they were told, were the ones who would resist the new order. Removing them was presented as necessary surgery for the future of the region. One young SS man, barely out of his 20s, had written letters home during training about how proud he felt to serve. He described the uniform, the sense of order, the belief that Germany was finally rising again after years of humiliation. When his unit received its first assignment in a Polish village, he expected something like the military exercises he had known: clear objectives, visible enemies, a sense of accomplishment at the end of the day. Instead, he found himself standing in a field while groups of men and women were brought forward. The orders were simple and final. He later wrote in a private letter to a friend that he had not expected the work to feel so heavy. He described the way some of the prisoners looked at him, not with anger, but with a kind of bewildered sadness, as if they could not quite believe this was happening. He did not sleep well for many nights afterward. He told himself it was duty. He told himself the victims had been enemies of the new Germany. Yet the images stayed with him, and he began to drink more than he once had, as if the alcohol could blur the line between what he had done and what he believed he had to do. In another town, a Polish priest was taken from his church in the middle of the night. He had spent decades serving his parish, baptizing children, comforting the sick, and speaking quietly against hatred whenever he could. When the men came for him, he asked only for a moment to pray. They allowed it. As he knelt, one of the younger soldiers looked away, unable to meet the priest's eyes. The priest was driven to a nearby forest where others like him, teachers, local leaders, Jewish merchants, had already been gathered. There were no long speeches. The work was carried out with the same bureaucratic efficiency that had marked the earlier police actions inside Germany. The priest's last thought, according to one survivor who escaped the scene, was not of anger but of the children in his parish who would now grow up without the comfort of the church he had tried to keep open. His body was left in a shallow grave that would not be found for years. Himmler himself visited some of these areas in the weeks after the invasion began. He moved through the newly occupied territory with the same careful attention to detail he had always shown in his offices in Germany. He inspected the work of the special units, listened to reports about how many had been removed, and spoke of the need for swift and thorough action. In his mind, this was the practical beginning of the vision he had carried for years, the creation of living space for Germans by clearing away those who did not belong. He saw the suffering not as tragedy but as necessary cost. When reports reached him of hesitation among some of the men, he issued instructions that emphasized the higher purpose. The weak must be removed so the strong could flourish. The land must be made ready for those who would cultivate it with German hands and German blood. He returned to his headquarters convinced that the work, however difficult, was moving in the right direction. For the people on the receiving end, the terror arrived without warning and without mercy. A Jewish family in a larger town heard rumors of what was happening in the countryside and tried to prepare. The father burned papers that might identify them as Jewish. The mother sewed money and a few pieces of jewelry into the lining of her coat. Their teenage son asked why they could not simply hide in the attic of a neighbor they had known for years. The father explained that even neighbors could no longer be trusted when fear spread so quickly. They left at night, carrying what they could, and joined a stream of others moving eastward. Along the way they saw houses marked with signs, shops looted, and groups of men being marched away under guard. The mother kept her hand on her son's shoulder, as if touch alone could protect him. When they reached a larger city that still seemed relatively calm, they found temporary shelter with distant relatives. The father wrote a short letter to a friend who had emigrated years earlier, describing the sudden collapse of everything they had built. He ended the letter by saying he did not know what the next weeks would bring, only that he would try to keep his family together for as long as he could. The psychological weight on the men carrying out the orders grew heavier with each passing day. Some wrote home in careful language, avoiding details but hinting at the strain. Others drank heavily in the evenings, trying to quiet the images that returned when they closed their eyes. A few spoke privately among themselves about the difference between fighting soldiers on a battlefield and shooting civilians who had done nothing more than exist in the wrong place. They told one another that this was different from ordinary war. It was something colder, more mechanical. Yet they continued because stopping would have meant questioning the entire structure of loyalty and duty they had accepted when they joined the SS. The same organization that had once given them a sense of purpose and belonging now required them to cross a line that many had not imagined they would ever face. Some adapted by dehumanizing the victims, repeating the phrases they had been taught about racial enemies and necessary cleansing. Others carried a quiet shame they could not admit even to their closest comrades. Himmler understood that this first wave of killing was only the beginning. He spoke of the need for more systematic approaches in the months ahead, resettlement on a larger scale, the creation of living space that would be truly German. The early operations in Poland served as a testing ground, not only for the methods but for the men themselves. Those who could carry out the work without breaking were considered reliable. Those who hesitated or showed too much distress were quietly moved aside or given other tasks. The organization was learning how to turn ordinary men into instruments of a larger plan, and how to keep the machinery running even when the human cost became visible. In the villages that survived the first sweeps, life continued in a diminished form. Families who had lost fathers or brothers learned to survive with less. Children grew quieter, learning early that certain questions should not be asked. A few small acts of kindness persisted, a neighbor sharing food with a widow, a stranger helping a lost child find her way home, a priest who had escaped the roundups continuing to offer what comfort he could in secret. These moments did not stop the larger machinery, but they reminded those who witnessed them that even in the midst of systematic cruelty, the impulse toward connection and mercy did not disappear entirely. It simply became more dangerous to act upon. The first waves of SS terror in Poland marked the moment when the ideology Himmler had spent years refining moved from words and policies into direct, physical destruction. What had begun as ideas about blood and soil, about strength and purity, now expressed itself in mass graves and emptied homes. The men who carried out the orders were changed by what they did, just as the society they were trying to reshape was changed by what was done to it. Some would later claim they had only followed orders. Others would carry the memory as a private burden they could never fully set down. For the victims and their families, the loss was permanent and often unacknowledged for years. The land itself seemed to absorb the silence, the fields where shootings took place, the forests where bodies were hidden, the towns where entire communities had once lived and now stood half empty. Bearing witness to these first atrocities and telling the stories of both victims and perpetrators with honesty requires sustained, careful work long after the dramatic events have passed. If the history we are exploring together has moved you, and if you believe these warnings must be kept alive for new generations, even a small tip on Ko-Fi, as little as $1, helps support the research and the time it takes to craft these narratives responsibly. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The operations in Poland did not remain isolated events. They became the foundation for everything that followed: the expansion of camps, the refinement of methods, the growing conviction among those in power that entire populations could be moved or removed according to a plan drawn on a map. Himmler returned from his visits with a clearer sense of what was possible. The SS had shown it could act with speed and finality when given the right orders and the right preparation. The psychological barriers that had once seemed solid had proven thinner than many had expected. For the men who had stood in those fields and done the work, there was no going back to the version of themselves that had existed before the invasion. They had crossed into a new territory, one where the line between soldier and executioner had blurred, and where the future of entire nations was being decided not by treaties or battles alone, but by the quiet, relentless application of terror in the spaces behind the front lines. The agony of Poland was only the beginning of a much larger story, one that would soon stretch across the continent and test the limits of what human beings could do to one another when ideology and power moved in the same direction. In the sprawling network of camps that spread across occupied Europe, human lives were no longer measured in years or hopes, but in the precise output of labor extracted before the body gave out. The SS had begun with a vision of elite men bound by loyalty and blood. By the middle years of the war, that vision had expanded into something far larger and colder, an economic empire built on the forced work of millions. What had started as concentration camps for political enemies and social outcasts grew into a vast system of factories, quarries, and workshops where prisoners were treated as raw material. The same organization that once guarded Hitler now owned businesses that produced bricks, armaments, textiles, and chemicals. The men who ran these enterprises spoke of efficiency, productivity, and the needs of the war effort. They rarely spoke of the human cost, because to do so would have required acknowledging that the system they managed depended on treating people as disposable resources rather than as individuals with names, families, and futures. A young Polish prisoner arrived at one of the larger camps after being rounded up in a street sweep. He had been a student before the war, full of plans for his life. Now he stood in a vast open area while guards shouted orders and dogs barked. He was given a number that replaced his name on every document and every roll call. In the barracks he shared a wooden bunk with several other men. There was little space to move, and the air smelled of unwashed bodies, damp straw, and fear. Each morning the prisoners were marched to work sites. Some went to nearby factories that produced parts for aircraft or vehicles. Others were sent to quarries where they broke stone under the sun or in freezing rain. The work was relentless. If a man slowed, he was beaten or shot. If he collapsed, he was dragged away and usually never seen again. The prisoner learned quickly that survival depended on staying invisible, on conserving every scrap of energy, and on finding tiny moments of solidarity with those around him. Sometimes a fellow prisoner would share a crust of bread saved from the meager ration. Sometimes a whispered word of encouragement passed between men who had never known each other before. These small acts did not change the system, but they reminded him that he was still human even when everything around him tried to prove otherwise. The men who oversaw this labor did not see the prisoners as individuals with inner lives. They saw numbers on ledgers, output quotas, and the cost of replacing workers who died. One SS administrator, a former accountant who had risen through the ranks by proving he could manage large operations, spent his days reviewing production reports and calculating how many new prisoners would be needed to meet the next month's targets. He lived in a comfortable house outside the camp perimeter with his wife and children. In the evenings he might read reports about labor shortages while his children played in the next room. He told himself that the work was necessary for the war, that the prisoners were enemies of the state who deserved their fate, and that any softness would only weaken the effort. When he visited the factories he wore gloves and kept a certain distance, as if physical closeness might contaminate him. He noticed the exhaustion on the prisoners' faces but trained himself not to dwell on it. Dwelling on it would have made the numbers harder to balance. His career depended on meeting quotas, not on asking whether the human material could endure the pace he demanded. Himmler took pride in this growing empire. He saw the SS businesses as proof that his organization could stand on its own, independent of the regular state and the army. The profits from slave labor helped fund SS projects, build SS settlements, and strengthen the organization's power. When reports reached him about production figures or new contracts, he spoke of the system with a kind of bureaucratic satisfaction. He believed the camps were performing a dual service, removing dangerous elements from society while contributing to the economic strength of the Reich. He did not need to witness the daily suffering to understand its scale. The ledgers told him what he needed to know. If too many workers died, the solution was simple: request more. The machinery of selection and transport had already proven it could supply labor on demand. Himmler viewed this as efficient management rather than moral failure. The prisoners were, in his mind, resources that could be used until they were spent, then replaced. This view allowed him to focus on expansion rather than on the human wreckage left behind. Inside the camps, the prisoners developed their own quiet forms of resistance and resilience. A group of workers in one factory secretly slowed their pace when the guards were not watching, not enough to be punished but enough to preserve a little strength for another day. A prisoner who had once been a teacher organized whispered lessons for younger men during the few moments of rest, passing on fragments of knowledge as an act of defiance against the effort to reduce them to animals. Letters were sometimes smuggled out through civilian workers or sympathetic guards, carrying messages of love and endurance to families who had no other way of knowing whether their loved one still lived. These acts were small and dangerous. They did not overthrow the system, but they kept a spark of humanity alive in places designed to extinguish it. The cost of discovery was severe, yet the need to remain human proved stronger than the fear for many. The psychological numbing required of those who ran the machine was profound. Guards and administrators learned to see the prisoners not as people but as units of labor that could be measured, moved, and discarded. A man who began his service with some hesitation often found that the daily routine of quotas and punishments dulled his earlier discomfort. He told himself stories about the necessity of the work, about the prisoners being less than fully human, about the greater good of the nation. These stories helped him sleep at night. When new transports arrived, he no longer looked too closely at the faces. He focused instead on how many could be sent to which work detail. The system rewarded this detachment. Those who showed too much feeling were considered unreliable. Those who performed their duties without visible emotion advanced. Over time, the boundary between professional duty and moral failure blurred until it became almost invisible. The fusion of genocidal ideology and cold economic calculation created a particularly brutal form of exploitation. Prisoners were worked to exhaustion because replacing them was cheaper than sustaining them. Food was kept at starvation levels because a well-fed worker might resist or survive longer than the plan allowed. Medical care was minimal because a sick prisoner was a liability on the balance sheet. The SS businesses operated with the logic of any large corporation: maximize output, minimize cost. Except that the labor force consisted of people who had already been condemned by the regime's racial and political categories. This made the suffering not an unfortunate side effect but a built-in feature of the system. The more efficiently the machine ran, the more lives it consumed. A prisoner who had once worked as a carpenter in his hometown found himself assigned to a construction detail building new barracks for incoming transports. He watched as new groups arrived, many of them families separated at the ramp, many of them clearly marked for immediate death rather than labor. He felt a deep helplessness at being forced to build the very structures that would house more suffering. Yet even in that helplessness he found small ways to assert his humanity. He would sometimes leave a tool in a place where another prisoner could use it to make a repair or ease a task. He shared whatever extra food he could scavenge. These acts were not heroic in the grand sense. They were the quiet refusals to let the system turn him completely into the expendable unit it wanted him to be. Himmler's pride in the economic empire grew as the war continued and the demand for labor increased. He saw the camps not only as instruments of punishment and extermination but as the foundation of an SS economic state that could outlast the conflict. The more the regular economy struggled under the pressures of war, the more the SS businesses expanded to fill the gaps. This growth required a steady supply of new workers, which in turn required the continued operation of the selection and deportation machinery. The system fed itself. The more efficiently it killed or worked people to death, the more it needed fresh labor to sustain production. This cycle was not an accident of poor planning. It was the logical outcome of treating human beings as interchangeable parts in a profit-driven machine. The transformation of human beings into expendable economic units inside a vast SS business empire left behind physical remnants, documents, and survivor testimony that reveal the industrial scale of the suffering in ways that words alone cannot fully convey. If you want to explore those remnants and hear extended conversations about how such a system was built and maintained, our Patreon community offers free bonus podcasts, raw and unblurred video segments that complement these narrations, early access to future episodes, and a space where we can discuss these histories together with fellow truth seekers who refuse to look away. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. For those who survived the labor camps, the memory of being reduced to a number and a quota stayed with them long after liberation. They carried the physical scars of beatings and starvation, but also the deeper wound of having been treated as less than human for months or years. Many spoke later of the small acts of kindness that had kept them alive, the shared piece of bread, the whispered word of encouragement, the refusal to betray a fellow prisoner. These moments stood out precisely because the system around them was designed to eliminate every trace of solidarity and dignity. The administrators and guards who ran the machine often returned to ordinary lives after the war, carrying their own forms of numbness or denial. Some never spoke of what they had done. Others convinced themselves that they had only been following orders in difficult times. The economic empire they had helped build collapsed with the regime, but the moral questions it raised did not disappear. How could a modern state turn the labor of its prisoners into profit? How could ordinary men and women participate in such a system without being broken by it? And what does it reveal about human nature when the machinery of death and the machinery of commerce operate in the same offices, under the same ledgers, measured by the same standards of efficiency? The SS economic empire did not arise from a single decision or a single man's vision. It grew from the steady expansion of an idea that had begun years earlier, that some lives were worth less than others, and that those lives could be used and discarded according to the needs of the state. Himmler's pride in the system reflected his belief that the SS had created something self-sustaining and powerful. What he did not fully reckon with was the human corrosion required to keep it running. The prisoners who endured it carried the memory of being treated as raw material. The men who managed it carried the memory of having treated them that way. Both carried the knowledge that a modern bureaucracy, armed with ideology and economic logic, could turn the daily business of living and dying into something that looked, on paper, like ordinary administration. That knowledge would haunt the post-war world long after the last factory had fallen silent and the last ledger had been closed. In a quiet villa on the edge of a frozen lake, a group of well-dressed men gathered around a long table, drank coffee from fine china, and discussed how to make an entire people disappear from the face of the earth. The men who arrived that winter morning carried briefcases and wore the ordinary uniforms of civil servants and military officers. They shook hands with practiced politeness, exchanged small talk about the weather and the difficulties of travel, and took their seats as if this were any other inter-ministry meeting. Yet the subject on the agenda was unlike any other. They had been summoned to coordinate the final destruction of Europe's Jewish population. The man who had called them together was not in the room that day, but his authority shaped every word spoken. Heinrich Himmler had already given the order that mass shootings in the East were not enough. The killings were too visible, too chaotic, too dependent on the endurance of the men pulling the triggers. A more systematic approach was needed, one that could be managed from desks and implemented through the ordinary machinery of the state. The conference was meant to turn that order into a workable plan. Heydrich chaired the meeting with the cold precision that had made him indispensable to Himmler. He spoke in measured tones, laying out the scale of the problem as he saw it. Millions of Jews across the continent would need to be removed. Some would be worked to death in labor camps. Others would be sent farther east for special treatment, a phrase that required no further explanation among the men at the table. Heydrich moved through the logistics with the same calm efficiency he brought to any administrative task. He wanted cooperation from the various ministries so that trains could be arranged, property could be seized without legal complications, and foreign governments could be persuaded or pressured to hand over their Jewish citizens. The tone in the room remained professional. No one raised their voice. No one spoke of hatred or revenge. They spoke instead of evacuation, of labor deployment, of the need to avoid unnecessary difficulties with the civilian population. The language itself created a distance between the men and the reality of what they were planning. One of the participants, a young and ambitious official from the foreign ministry, listened carefully and took notes. He had risen quickly through the ranks by proving himself reliable and ideologically sound. In his private thoughts he felt a mixture of pride and unease. Pride that he had been included in such an important gathering, unease at the casual way the deaths of millions were being turned into columns on a chart. He told himself that this was the necessary work of statecraft in wartime. He told himself that the Jews had brought this upon themselves through their supposed influence and disloyalty. Yet when he looked around the elegant room, with its polished wood and the view of the lake beyond the windows, He could not entirely shake the sense that something irreversible was being decided over sandwiches and coffee. He said little during the discussion. He nodded at the right moments and recorded the agreements. Later, when he returned to his office, he filed his notes without dwelling on what they meant for the people whose lives were being reduced to transport schedules. Another man at the table, an official from the Justice Ministry, had spent his career interpreting laws and regulations. He asked practical questions about how to handle mixed marriages and the legal status of half-Jews. His tone was that of a conscientious bureaucrat trying to get the details right. He did not argue against the overall plan. He simply wanted to know how the existing legal framework could be adjusted so that the operation would proceed smoothly. In his mind, he was performing his professional duty. The human beings whose fates were being decided remained abstract categories, full Jews, half-Jews, quarter Jews, rather than fathers, mothers, and children who would soon be torn from their homes. This abstraction made the conversation possible. If the men around the table had been forced to picture the specific faces of those they were condemning, the meeting might have felt different. Instead, they dealt in numbers and categories, and the clean language of administration. Himmler himself was not present, yet his presence shaped the atmosphere. The men knew that the orders originated with him and that he expected results. They understood that failure to cooperate would not be viewed kindly. Some were enthusiastic about the plan, seeing it as a bold solution to a problem they had long believed existed. Others were more cautious, worried about practical obstacles or international reactions, but they did not voice fundamental objections. The meeting lasted only a few hours. By the time it ended, the broad outlines of the operation had been agreed upon. The details would be worked out later by subordinates who would never sit in such a room or speak so directly about what was being done. The men gathered their papers, shook hands again, and left the villa to return to their ordinary lives. Some went home to their families that evening. Others attended social events or continued their usual routines. The horror of what they had discussed did not visibly disturb the surface of their days. On the ground, far from the villa, the consequences of that meeting began to unfold in the lives of ordinary people. In a crowded ghetto in occupied Poland, a Jewish family received orders to prepare for resettlement. The father, a former shopkeeper, tried to reassure his wife and children that they would be sent to work in the East, that they would stay together if they followed the instructions. He had heard rumors of terrible things happening in the forests and camps, but he clung to the hope that the official notices were truthful. His wife packed a small bag with warm clothes and a few precious photographs. She did not tell her children what she feared. She focused instead on keeping them calm and fed. When the trains arrived, they were herded into cattle cars with hundreds of others. The journey was long and brutal. There was little food or water. People became ill. Some died before they reached their destination. The father held his youngest child close and whispered stories to distract her from the cries around them. He did not know that the destination had been decided months earlier in a meeting room where no one had spoken his name or imagined his face. The men who had attended the conference returned to their desks and continued their work. One of them, the meticulous organizer who had taken the official notes, spent the following weeks and months turning the agreements into detailed instructions. He coordinated with railway officials, with camp administrators, with local police forces across Europe. He traveled when necessary, inspected facilities, and ensured that the machinery ran on schedule. In his private correspondence, he rarely mentioned the human cost. He wrote instead about quotas met, difficulties overcome, and the importance of maintaining order. He told himself that he was performing a difficult but necessary task. When doubts arose, he pushed them aside by focusing on the next set of logistics. The enormity of what he was helping to accomplish was kept at a distance by the sheer volume of paperwork and meetings. It was easier to think in terms of train cars and arrival times than in terms of the lives those trains carried. The language used at the conference and in the documents that followed created a protective layer around the participants. Words like evacuation and special treatment allowed men to discuss mass murder without confronting its reality directly. This linguistic distancing was not unique to that meeting. It had already been developing in the earlier phases of persecution and killing. But at WW2 it reached a new level of bureaucratic refinement. The men who spoke those words were not shouting fanatics. They were educated administrators who understood how modern states function. They knew that large-scale operations required coordination between different agencies, clear lines of authority, and careful attention to legal and logistical details. What they applied those skills to was the destruction of human beings on a continental scale. The contrast between their civilized manner and the content of their discussion remains one of the most disturbing aspects of that day. For the families whose lives were being decided, the process felt anything but bureaucratic. A young woman in a small town in the Netherlands received a notice to report for labor service in the East. She had recently married and was expecting her first child. She and her husband tried to find ways to avoid the order. They contacted friends who might hide them. They considered fleeing, though they had little money and no clear destination. In the end, they decided to report, hoping that compliance would protect them. When they arrived at the collection point, they were separated. The husband was sent to one camp, the wife to another. She gave birth in terrible conditions and never saw her child grow beyond infancy. The husband survived the war but spent years searching for any trace of his family. The decisions made in the villa had reached into their lives with devastating finality, yet none of the men at the table had ever known their names. The conference itself was a single afternoon in a pleasant room. Its consequences stretched across years and across an entire continent. The coordination it achieved made the killings more efficient and more difficult to escape. Trains ran on schedule. Camps received the numbers of prisoners they had been told to expect. Local authorities in occupied and allied countries were given clear instructions about who to round up and when. The men who had sat around the table returned to their careers and, in most cases, to lives that continued without immediate consequence for what they had helped set in motion. Some were later tried and punished. Others lived out their days in relative obscurity, their role in the meeting largely forgotten until historians began to piece together the record. The ordinary nature of their participation, the fact that they had behaved like civil servants doing their jobs, makes the event all the more difficult to comprehend and all the more important to remember. The single, almost ordinary bureaucratic meeting that coordinated continent-wide genocide stands as one of the most consequential shadow operations of the entire war. If you want to understand how such hidden decisions shaped the conflict and to explore other extraordinary secret operations that decided the fate of nations, I invite you to sign up for our free email newsletter. As a thank you, you will receive the powerful ebook The Shadow War, 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II, along with weekly deep dive articles that uncover forgotten stories of espionage, resistance, and the hidden battles behind the public events. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The men who left the villa that day had not invented the idea of destroying the Jewish population. That idea had been circulating in Nazi circles for years, expressed in speeches, pamphlets, and private conversations. What they accomplished was to move it from the realm of intention and scattered violence into the realm of coordinated state policy. They created the administrative framework that allowed the killings to continue even when the initial wave of shootings proved difficult to sustain. They ensured that different parts of the regime worked together rather than at cross purposes. In doing so, they helped turn a campaign of terror into something that looked, on paper, like a rational program of population management. The human reality behind those papers, the families torn apart, the children who never grew up, the survivors who carried the memory of loss for the rest of their lives, remained invisible to the men in the room. That invisibility was not accidental. It was the product of language, of bureaucratic habit, and of a system that rewarded those who could focus on the task without being distracted by its moral weight. The conference did not end the story of the Holocaust. It marked the moment when the machinery of destruction was given its final, terrible instructions and sent out into the world to do its work. In a grand hall in the Polish city of Poznań, Heinrich Himmler stood before the leaders of his SS and did something almost no one in his position had ever done. He spoke openly about the mass murder of an entire people as if it were a noble and necessary task. The men who gathered that day were not ordinary soldiers or bureaucrats. They were the highest-ranking officers of the organization Himmler had spent years shaping into an elite force. They had already carried out the first waves of killing in Poland and the Soviet Union. They had overseen the expansion of the camp system and the early operations of the Einsatzgruppen. Many of them had seen the results of those orders with their own eyes. Yet until that moment, the full scope of what was happening had remained wrapped in layers of euphemism and compartmentalization. Himmler had decided it was time to change that. He wanted his men to understand that the extermination of the Jews was not a secret side operation carried out by a few specialists. It was the central task of the SS, and every man in that room bore responsibility for its success. He began his speech in his usual careful, almost pedantic tone. He spoke first about the war, about the sacrifices being made at the front, about the need for absolute loyalty. The men listened with the disciplined attention they had been trained to show. Then his words shifted. He told them that they now faced a task that was the hardest and most difficult in their history. He said that the Jewish people were being exterminated. He used the word directly. He did not say evaluated or resettled or given special treatment. He said exterminated. The room grew very still. Some men shifted in their seats. Others kept their eyes fixed straight ahead, as they had been taught to do when receiving difficult orders. Himmler continued. He told them that this extermination was a glorious page in their history, one that would never be written but that they would carry with them as a secret bond. He said that most of them knew what it meant to see 100 corpses lying together, or 500, or 1,000. He said that to have gone through that and to have remained decent men, that was what had made them hard. The psychological weight of those words settled over the audience like a heavy coat. For months, even years, these officers had carried out killings while telling themselves stories that softened the reality. They had spoken of security operations, of pacification, of removing dangerous elements. They had focused on the mechanics of transport and execution rather than on the faces of the people they were destroying. Now their leader was stripping away those protections. He was telling them that what they had done was not a regrettable necessity but a historical achievement. He was binding them together through shared guilt and shared knowledge. The man who had once been too weak to fight in the last war was now asking his followers to accept that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. One of the officers sitting in that hall was a man who had joined the SS in its early years because he believed it offered a path to discipline and purpose. He had participated in the operations in the East and had learned to numb himself to what he saw. After the speech, he wrote a letter to his wife that he never sent. In it he described the strange mixture of pride and dread he felt. Pride that he had been trusted with such a secret, dread that the secret would now live inside him forever. He told her that the work was hard but necessary. He did not describe what the work actually was. He could not bring himself to put those details on paper. Instead, he wrote about the weather and about how he missed their children. The letter remained in his pocket for weeks before he finally burned it. He could not risk anyone else reading what he had almost confessed. Another officer reacted differently. He had always been one of the most enthusiastic supporters of the racial policies. After the speech, he felt a surge of renewed purpose. He told his subordinates that they were part of something historic and that they should carry themselves with the pride of men who were shaping the future. In private, however, he began to drink more heavily than before. He found that the nights were harder than the days. When he closed his eyes, he sometimes saw images from the operations he had overseen. He told himself that these were the necessary burdens of leadership. He repeated the phrases from Himmler's speech like a private mantra. The extermination was a glorious page. They had remained decent. They had done what weaker men could not have done. Yet the alcohol helped quiet the moments when those phrases felt hollow. Himmler himself seemed both relieved and burdened after the speech. He had taken a risk by speaking so directly. He had broken the unspoken rule that the worst crimes should remain wrapped in bureaucratic language. By doing so, he had created a bond of shared knowledge among his men. They could no longer pretend they did not know what was happening. They were all complicit now, not just in action but in understanding. That complicity was meant to strengthen their loyalty. A man who has confessed to murder alongside his comrades is less likely to turn against them. Himmler understood this psychological mechanism even if he never named it in those terms. He had watched how the early killings had sometimes left men shaken and uncertain. By making the extermination explicit and framing it as a historical necessity, he gave them a story they could tell themselves. They were not ordinary killers. They were the hard men who had done what history required. The private doubts that many of these officers carried were rarely spoken aloud. One man wrote in his diary about the difficulty of reconciling the image of himself as a good German and a good father with the reality of what he had ordered and witnessed. He described nights when he could not sleep and days when he threw himself into work to avoid thinking. He noted small acts of kindness he sometimes allowed among the prisoners under his control, as if those moments could balance the larger cruelty. He did not question the overall policy. He questioned only his own ability to endure it without breaking. The diary entries grew shorter over time. Eventually, he stopped writing altogether. The effort of maintaining two versions of himself, one for the official record and one for his private thoughts, had become too exhausting. The speech also served another purpose that Himmler may not have fully articulated even to himself. It marked a moment when the extermination moved from being primarily a matter of field operations to being a matter of state policy that required the full commitment of the SS leadership. By speaking so openly, Himmler was preparing his men for the next phase, the one that would involve the death camps operating at full capacity. He was telling them that there would be no turning back and that any hesitation would be seen as weakness. The men who left the hall that day carried with them not only new knowledge but a new sense of what was expected of them. They returned to their commands with a clearer understanding that mercy was not an option and that the only acceptable response to the task was efficiency and endurance. The psychological burden carried by these perpetrators was real even when it was hidden. Some turned to alcohol as a way to dull the edges of memory. Others threw themselves into their work with a kind of desperate intensity, as if constant activity could prevent reflection. A few sought small comforts in the ordinary routines of life, a letter from home, a shared meal with comrades, a moment of quiet in which they could pretend the larger world did not exist. These moments of ordinary humanity stood in stark contrast to the work they performed. The contrast itself became part of the coping mechanism. A man could be kind to his own children while ordering the deaths of other children. He could write tender letters to his wife while overseeing the destruction of families. The human mind proved remarkably capable of holding these contradictions without shattering, at least for a time. Himmler's decision to speak so directly was unusual for a leader who usually preferred the safety of euphemism. It revealed both his confidence in the loyalty of his men and his awareness that the psychological strain of the killings was becoming harder to manage through silence alone. By naming the crime and framing it as glorious, he attempted to transform guilt into pride and secrecy into shared purpose. The success of that attempt varied from man to man. Some left the speech feeling more committed than ever. Others carried a heavier private burden than before. All of them now lived with the knowledge that their leader had looked them in the eye and told them exactly what they were doing. That knowledge could not be forgotten. It could only be carried, justified, or numbed. Some of the most powerful survivor and perpetrator testimonies are best experienced in their full, uninterrupted narrative form through expert audiobook narration. If you want to continue absorbing these vital stories while driving, walking, or simply having a quiet moment to reflect, I highly recommend downloading a deeply researched audiobook on Audible, such as Comprehensive Histories of the Third Reich or Powerful Survivor Testimonies. These allow you to experience the human texture of this history in a way that stays with you long after you finish listening. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The speech at Posen did not change the course of the extermination. That machinery was already in motion and would continue until the final days of the war. What the speech did change was the internal landscape of the men who carried it out. By speaking the unspeakable, Himmler had forced his followers to confront the reality of their actions in a way that euphemism had previously allowed them to avoid. Some accepted that reality and made it part of their identity. Others struggled with it in silence. All of them became, in that moment, more deeply bound to the organization and to each other through the shared knowledge of what they had done and what they were still expected to do. The man who had once been too frail for military service had now asked his elite force to accept that they were the instruments of history's most terrible judgment. Whether they carried that burden with pride or with hidden dread, they carried it together. And that shared weight would remain with them long after the war ended and the world began to reckon with what had been done in those years of silence and speech. By the middle years of the war, the quiet organizer who had once commanded only a handful of bodyguards now stood at the head of an army that rivaled the regular German forces, while fighting battles not only on distant fronts but in the corridors of power closer to home. Heinrich Himmler had spent years building the SS into something far more than a protective escort for Hitler. What began as a small elite guard had grown, through relentless effort and political maneuvering, into a parallel military force known as the Waffen-SS. By the time the war had settled into its grinding middle phase, this force numbered in the hundreds of thousands and would eventually approach 1 million men. It drew not only from German volunteers but from occupied countries across Europe, men who came for reasons as varied as ideological conviction, the promise of adventure, or the simple hope of better treatment than their countrymen received under occupation. Himmler saw in this expansion the fulfillment of a long-held dream, an army loyal only to him and to the vision of a racially pure Reich, one that could operate independently of the traditional military structure and answer directly to the Führer. For the men who joined these ranks, the experience was often a mixture of pride and disillusionment. A young German recruit who had grown up hearing stories of the SS as an elite brotherhood arrived at training with high expectations. He had been told that these soldiers were the best of the best, held to stricter standards of discipline and racial purity. In the early weeks he felt the thrill of belonging to something larger than himself. The black uniforms, the rigorous drills, the sense that he was part of a historic mission, all of it fed a deep need for purpose. Yet as the training gave way to deployment on the Eastern Front, the reality proved harsher than the propaganda. He saw comrades fall in brutal fighting, witnessed the harsh treatment of civilians in occupied areas, and felt the growing gap between the noble ideals he had been taught and the daily grind of survival. In letters home he tried to describe the sense of duty that still drove him, but he left out the moments of doubt that crept in during quiet nights in the trenches. Those doubts he carried alone, afraid that voicing them would mark him as unworthy of the uniform he wore. Foreign volunteers often arrived with even more complicated motivations. A young man from occupied France or the Netherlands might have joined because he believed in the fight against Bolshevism, or because he saw the SS as a path to status and adventure that civilian life under occupation could not offer. He trained alongside Germans who sometimes viewed him with suspicion, yet he also formed bonds with fellow foreigners who shared his sense of displacement. In battle he discovered that courage and fear existed side by side regardless of nationality. Small acts of kindness, sharing a cigarette during a lull, helping a wounded comrade from another country, became the threads that held men together when ideology alone proved insufficient. One such volunteer later recalled how a German sergeant had once risked his own safety to pull him from a burning vehicle. That moment of ordinary humanity stayed with him long after the larger cause had lost its shine. It reminded him that even in a force built on exclusion and supremacy, individual men could still reach across lines drawn by propaganda. Himmler watched the growth of this army with a mixture of satisfaction and constant vigilance. He had fought hard to expand its role beyond mere guard duties, securing the right to form combat divisions and to recruit from across Europe. Each new success brought him closer to the vision of an independent SS state within the state. Yet that very success created new problems. The regular army, the Wehrmacht, viewed the Waffen-SS with a mixture of resentment and alarm. Its officers saw the black uniformed force as a rival that siphoned off resources, manpower, and Hitler's favor. Himmler, in turn, pushed for greater influence over military strategy, often clashing with generals who had spent their careers in the traditional military hierarchy. These were not abstract bureaucratic disputes. They played out in meetings where voices rose and tempers flared, and letters that carried carefully worded complaints to Hitler's headquarters, and in the quiet calculations of men who understood that power in the Nazi system was never secure. One such clash occurred when Himmler insisted on committing Waffen-SS divisions to a particular offensive despite objections from Wehrmacht commanders who argued that the troops were not yet ready or that the plan was flawed. Himmler saw the deployment as a chance to prove the superiority of his force and to gain more ground in the endless competition for resources. The generals saw it as reckless interference by a man who had never led troops in the field. The argument reached Hitler, who sometimes favored one side and sometimes the other depending on his mood and the latest battlefield reports. For Himmler, these moments carried a personal edge. He had built his career on loyalty and administrative skill rather than battlefield command. Now he was demanding a seat at the table where strategy was decided, and he felt the resistance from men who viewed him as an outsider. In private, he expressed frustration that the old military elite still refused to accept the SS as an equal partner. In public, he maintained the calm, methodical demeanor that had always served him well, but those closest to him noticed the strain in his voice during late-night discussions. Rivalries at the highest levels added another layer of tension. Hermann Göring, once the powerful head of the Luftwaffe and a favorite of Hitler, had seen his influence wane as the air war turned against Germany. Himmler watched this decline with careful attention, recognizing an opportunity to fill the vacuum. Yet he also had to contend with Martin Bormann, Hitler's secretary and a master of palace intrigue who controlled access to the Führer and shaped the flow of information. Bormann viewed any independent power center with suspicion, and the growing Waffen-SS represented exactly that. Meetings between these men were exercises in veiled hostility. Compliments were exchanged, agreements were reached on paper, but behind the scenes each worked to limit the other's reach. Himmler found himself constantly balancing the need to expand his military arm with the need to avoid appearing as a direct threat to Hitler's authority. The constant maneuvering took a toll. He slept less, relied more on reports from loyal subordinates, and carried the private fear that any misstep could bring his entire edifice crashing down. For the soldiers in the field, these high-level struggles often felt distant until they directly affected supplies, replacements, or orders. A Waffen-SS division might receive priority in equipment 1 month and find itself shortchanged the next as rival factions in Berlin shifted the balance. Men on the ground learned to navigate these invisible currents by focusing on the immediate tasks of survival and combat. A young officer who had risen quickly through the ranks because of his loyalty to SS ideals found himself caught between admiration for Himmler's vision and frustration with the inefficiencies created by internal competition. In letters to his family, he described the pride he felt when his unit performed well, but he also hinted at the exhaustion of fighting both the enemy and the system that was supposed to support him. He kept these letters carefully worded, aware that any hint of criticism could be used against him. The resilience he showed came not only from physical endurance but from the quiet determination to protect his men from the worst effects of bureaucratic infighting. The human cost of these parallel structures and rivalries extended beyond the battlefield. As the Waffen-SS grew, it absorbed resources that might otherwise have gone to the regular army, creating resentment among Wehrmacht soldiers who already faced shortages. At the same time, the foreign volunteers who had joined with high hopes sometimes discovered that their treatment depended on the shifting politics of the moment. A unit from one occupied country might receive praise and supplies when it suited Himmler's propaganda needs, only to be sidelined when priorities changed. These men carried the added burden of fighting for a cause that often viewed their own homelands with contempt. Small acts of solidarity, sharing rations across national lines, covering for a comrade who had received bad news from home, became essential to maintaining morale in an environment where official support could be withdrawn without warning. Himmler's own position grew more precarious even as his formal power expanded. He now commanded not only the police and the camps, but a military force that operated outside traditional chains of command. This gave him leverage in his dealings with rivals, yet it also made him a target. Any failure on the battlefield could be used by Göring or Bormann to undermine him with Hitler. Any sign of overreach could trigger a backlash from the Wehrmacht leadership. Himmler responded by tightening his grip on the Waffen-SS, demanding ever greater loyalty and weeding out those he suspected of insufficient commitment. He continued to visit units when possible, speaking to the men in the same measured tone he used in Berlin offices. He told them they were the vanguard of a new order, that their sacrifices would be remembered. The soldiers listened, some inspired, and some simply too tired to question the larger narrative. In those moments Himmler felt the weight of the responsibility he had created for himself. The small guard force he had once led had become an army whose successes and failures now reflected directly on him. The growth of this parallel force and the constant internal power struggles it generated revealed a fundamental truth about the regime Himmler served. A system built on competing centers of power and personal loyalty could expand dramatically in the short term, yet it carried within it the seeds of inefficiency and eventual collapse. Resources were duplicated or wasted as factions maneuvered against one another. Decisions that should have been made on military grounds were influenced by political calculations. Men who might have worked together against a common enemy instead spent energy protecting their own positions. Himmler understood these dynamics better than most because he had helped create them. He had built the SS into a state within a state precisely because he distrusted the existing structures. Now that his creation had grown powerful enough to challenge those structures, he found himself fighting to maintain control over it while fending off attacks from every direction. The material culture and visual records of the war help us understand the scale of resources and rivalries that defined the Nazi leadership's final years. If you find yourself drawn to tangible reminders of this history, or if you want to honor the courage and sacrifice of those who stood against such darkness in every theater of the war, there are carefully curated collections of World War II historical memorabilia, books, and documentaries available on Amazon. You can also settle in with the powerful film Midway on Prime Video, which brings to life the determination of men fighting across the Pacific in the same global struggle. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the war ground on, Himmler's Black Army continued to grow even as the overall situation deteriorated. New divisions were formed, often with less training and fewer resources than earlier units. Foreign recruitment increased out of desperation as German manpower dwindled. The internal rivalries showed no sign of easing. Each victory on the battlefield strengthened Himmler's hand temporarily, while each defeat gave his enemies fresh ammunition. Through it all he maintained the outward appearance of calm control that had always been his trademark. In private he carried the accumulating strain of command, the knowledge that the empire he had built rested on foundations that were beginning to crack. The man who had once felt overlooked and physically weak now commanded forces that could shape the course of battles and the fate of nations. Yet the very power he had sought brought with it new forms of isolation and new sources of fear. The Black Army had risen, but the price of its ascent was a constant state of internal war that no amount of expansion could finally resolve. Even the man who had sworn absolute loyalty to Adolf Hitler, who had built an empire of terror in his name, began to whisper in secret channels as the Reich crumbled around him, driven by the oldest human instinct of all, the will to survive. Heinrich Himmler had spent more than 20 years shaping his entire existence around one central conviction: that Adolf Hitler was Germany's savior and that absolute obedience to him was the highest form of duty. He had purged rivals, expanded the SS into a state within a state, and overseen the machinery of mass murder without visible hesitation. Yet by the final months of the war, as Soviet armies closed in from the east and Western forces advanced from the west, even Himmler could no longer ignore the reality that the regime he had helped create was collapsing. The man who had once spoken of extermination as a glorious historical necessity now found himself quietly exploring ways to preserve something of his own power and perhaps his own life by reaching out to the very enemies he had once vowed to destroy. The first tentative steps were taken through intermediaries who could carry messages without immediately exposing Himmler's involvement. Count Folke Bernadotte of Sweden, a neutral figure with connections to both sides, became one such channel. Himmler's representatives met with him in quiet locations, speaking in careful, coded language about the possibility of a separate peace with the Western Allies. The proposals were framed as a way to avoid further bloodshed and to prevent the complete destruction of Germany. Behind the careful words lay a more desperate calculation: if the Western powers could be persuaded to turn against the Soviet Union, or at least to treat the remaining German forces with some leniency, then perhaps a fragment of the Nazi state could survive. Himmler did not yet openly betray Hitler in these conversations. He presented himself as a pragmatic leader seeking to end a hopeless war. But the very act of initiating such contacts marked a profound shift. The man who had once described any form of disloyalty as unthinkable was now testing the boundaries of what he could get away with. For Himmler personally, these secret overtures carried an enormous emotional weight. He had built his identity around being the most loyal of Hitler's servants. In private moments, away from his staff and his files, he must have felt the sharp edge of that contradiction. He continued to issue orders and make public statements that affirmed his devotion to the Führer, yet at the same time he authorized back-channel discussions that could, if discovered, be seen as treason. The strain showed in small ways. He became more withdrawn during meetings with his closest aides. He spent longer hours alone with reports and maps, as if searching for some last maneuver that could turn the tide. When he spoke of the war in private, his voice sometimes carried a note of exhaustion that he had rarely allowed himself to show before. The man who had once believed in the inevitability of German victory now had to confront the possibility that everything he had built might be swept away. Those around him sensed the change even if they could not name it. A loyal SS officer who had served Himmler for years later described how his superiors seemed increasingly preoccupied during the final weeks. The officer had been accustomed to receiving clear, decisive instructions. Now those instructions sometimes arrived with unusual qualifiers or were followed by requests for more information than usual. The officer did not yet suspect outright disloyalty, but he felt a growing unease, as if the ground beneath the entire structure of the SS was beginning to shift. He continued to carry out his duties with the same outward discipline, yet he found himself wondering privately what the future held if the man at the center of their world was no longer certain of the path forward. The intermediaries themselves carried their own burdens. Bernadotte, as a neutral representative, had to balance the need to convey accurate information with the risk of becoming entangled in the collapsing Nazi regime. Each meeting required careful preparation and equally careful reporting back to his own government. He encountered men who spoke with the old arrogance of power even as their world fell apart, and he also encountered moments of surprising human vulnerability. One of Himmler's envoys, during a particularly tense discussion, briefly let slip the fear that all of them might soon face judgment for what had been done in the name of the Reich. The envoy quickly recovered and returned to the official script, but the momentary crack in the facade stayed with Bernadotte. It was a reminder that even those who had carried out terrible orders were still capable of feeling the weight of what was coming. Himmler's calculations were driven by a mixture of self-preservation and a lingering belief that he might still shape events. He understood that his position was unique. As head of the SS and the police, he controlled vast resources and information networks. He also knew that Hitler's trust in him, while still strong on the surface, was not immune to the pressures of defeat. If the Führer learned of these secret contacts, the consequences would be immediate and final. Himmler therefore moved with extreme caution, using trusted intermediaries and limiting the circle of people who knew the full extent of what was being discussed. At the same time, he continued to present himself publicly as the embodiment of loyalty. He issued orders for continued resistance, praised the sacrifices of German soldiers, and maintained the outward rituals of devotion to Hitler. The contrast between his public face and his private actions created a double life that must have been psychologically exhausting even for a man as disciplined as he was. The human instinct for survival that drove these overtures was not unique to Himmler. Across the collapsing Reich, men who had once sworn eternal loyalty to the Nazi cause were beginning to look for ways to distance themselves from it. Some destroyed documents. Others quietly reached out to old contacts who might offer protection after the war. Himmler's actions were different in scale because of the power he still wielded, but they reflected the same underlying human response to existential threat. The ideology that had once seemed unbreakable was proving less durable than the basic desire to avoid personal ruin. For a man who had spent his adult life building a system based on absolute obedience and the elimination of perceived weakness, this turn towards self-preservation represented a profound internal collapse. The emotional consequences of these secret negotiations extended beyond Himmler himself. Those who served him closely had to navigate their own loyalties. An aide who suspected what was happening faced a terrible choice: remain silent and risk being implicated if the overtures were discovered, or speak out and almost certainly face punishment for disloyalty. Most chose silence, either out of fear or out of a lingering belief that Himmler knew what he was doing. The atmosphere within the SS leadership grew heavier with unspoken tension. Men who had once competed openly for favor now watched each other more carefully, unsure who could still be trusted. Small acts of caution replaced the earlier displays of ideological enthusiasm. A word spoken too freely could now carry dangerous consequences. Himmler's secret overtures also revealed the limits of the power he had accumulated. For all his control over the SS and the police, he could not change the military reality on the ground. The Western Allies had no interest in negotiating a separate peace that would allow Germany to continue fighting the Soviet Union. The contacts through Bernadotte and others produced no meaningful breakthroughs. Instead, they left Himmler in an increasingly isolated position, still publicly bound to Hitler while privately exploring paths that could only lead to betrayal if discovered. The man who had once commanded fear across occupied Europe now found himself dependent on the goodwill of neutral intermediaries and the uncertain calculations of his enemies. The desperate, secret back-channel negotiations of a man who once held absolute power left behind a trail of documents and photographs from those final chaotic weeks that revealed the human panic and calculation behind the public facade of loyalty. If you want to confront the full, unfiltered visual record of how that facade cracked under the pressure of approaching defeat, the faces of the men involved, the hurried notes, the quiet meetings that could have changed the end of the war, there is an exclusive digital collection available on Gumroad that brings together rare and censored photographs, documents, and footage from the SS and Gestapo era. This material is too graphic or restricted for us to show here, but it is essential for anyone who wants to understand the reality behind the final maneuvers of the Nazi leadership. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the weeks passed and the military situation grew more desperate, Himmler's private calculations became more urgent. He continued to explore avenues for negotiation while maintaining the appearance of unwavering loyalty. The strain of holding these two realities together must have been immense. He had built his entire adult life on the belief that loyalty to Hitler and to the Nazi cause was the only path worth following. Now he was forced to confront the possibility that continuing on that path would lead only to destruction. The whispers of defeat had become too loud to ignore, even for the man who had once believed most strongly in final victory. The secret overtures were his attempt to find a way through the collapse, but they also marked the beginning of the end for the carefully constructed world he had created. The man who had once commanded an empire of fear was now reduced to hoping that his enemies might show him the mercy he had never shown others. That hope would prove as fragile as the regime he had helped build. In the final days of a collapsing empire, the man who had once commanded fear across an entire continent found himself standing before a mirror, shaving away the mustache that had become part of his identity, preparing to vanish into a world that no longer feared him. Heinrich Himmler had spent years building a reputation as the cold, methodical enforcer of Hitler's will. He had overseen the expansion of the SS into a state within a state, directed the machinery of terror, and positioned himself as one of the most powerful figures in the Reich. Yet in the chaotic final weeks, as Allied armies closed in from every direction and the Nazi leadership fractured under the weight of its own failures, that power evaporated almost overnight. Hitler, in a final act of rage and betrayal, stripped Himmler of his titles and ordered his arrest after learning of the secret overtures to the Western Allies. The man who had once believed himself indispensable was suddenly a fugitive in his own collapsing country, reduced to the most basic human instinct of survival. The decision to disguise himself came quickly, born of desperation rather than careful planning. Himmler shaved off the distinctive mustache that had long been part of his public image. He placed a black eye patch over one eye, altering his appearance in a way that felt almost theatrical in its simplicity. He adopted the false identity of Heinrich Himmler, a former member of the secret police whose papers he had acquired. The transformation was meant to make him invisible, to allow him to blend into the flood of refugees and defeated soldiers moving across a shattered landscape. Yet even as he changed his outward appearance, the inner man remained marked by the weight of everything he had done. The same hands that had signed orders for mass murder now fumbled with a razor and a borrowed uniform, trying to erase the very features that had once symbolized his authority. Those who traveled with him in those final days witnessed a side of Himmler that few had ever seen. A small group of loyal aides and SS officers accompanied him as he moved through the countryside, avoiding main roads and military checkpoints. One of these men later described how Himmler seemed both frantic and oddly detached, issuing orders in the same calm tone he had always used while his eyes betrayed a growing fear. The group slept in barns and abandoned buildings, sharing meager rations and speaking in low voices about what might come next. In these moments of forced intimacy, small gestures of ordinary humanity persisted. One aide offered Himmler a piece of bread he had saved from his own ration. Another quietly adjusted the eye patch when it slipped during a long night march. These acts were not born of deep affection but of the shared recognition that they were all now hunted men, dependent on one another for survival in a world that had turned against them. For Himmler himself, the experience carried layers of humiliation and disbelief. He had spent his adult life constructing a persona of iron discipline and unwavering loyalty. Now that persona was being stripped away piece by piece. The eye patch itched against his skin. The false papers felt fragile in his pocket. Every encounter with strangers or passing soldiers carried the risk of recognition. He found himself constantly calculating distances to the next safe place, weighing the chance that someone might remember his face from old photographs or newsreels. The man who had once decided the fates of millions now worried about whether a farmer might turn him in for a reward or a scrap of food. The psychological shift was profound. Power had insulated him from ordinary fears for years. Its sudden absence left him exposed to every shadow and every suspicious glance. The landscape through which they moved mirrored the inner collapse. Villages lay half destroyed from bombing raids. Roads were clogged with refugees carrying whatever possessions they could salvage. Defeated soldiers wandered without clear direction, some still clinging to their weapons and others already discarding them in ditches. Himmler and his small party passed through this human wreckage like ghosts, trying to remain unnoticed while every mile brought them closer to the advancing Allied lines. In quiet moments during rest stops, Himmler sometimes spoke of the war's turning point, of how things might have gone differently if only certain decisions had been made earlier. These reflections carried no admission of personal responsibility. They were the rationalizations of a man still trying to make sense of a world that had rejected everything he had believed in. His companions listened in silence, each carrying their own private calculations about how much longer loyalty would be worth the risk. The capture came almost by accident, in a way that underscored the absurdity of his fall. British soldiers manning a checkpoint stopped the small group as they tried to cross into a new area. Himmler, still wearing the eye patch and traveling under his false name, presented his papers without drawing special attention. The soldiers were tired and overworked, dealing with thousands of displaced people every day. They saw before them an ordinary-looking man in a nondescript uniform, nothing to mark him as different from the countless others they had already processed. It was only later, when another member of the group made a careless remark or when something in the papers raised a minor question, that suspicion began to grow. The process of verification was slow and bureaucratic. Himmler was taken to a holding area along with others, still maintaining his disguise and his false identity. For a brief time he must have believed he might slip through unnoticed, that the chaos of the collapsing front would protect him as it had protected so many others. The moment of recognition, when it came, was quiet rather than dramatic. A British intelligence officer reviewing the detainees noticed something familiar in the man with the eye patch. A closer examination of the papers, a comparison with known photographs, and the truth emerged. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the SS terror apparatus and one of the most wanted men in Europe, had been caught trying to disappear into the flood of ordinary defeated soldiers. The revelation spread quickly among the British personnel. Some felt a surge of professional satisfaction at having captured such a high-value target. Others simply felt the strange anticlimax of seeing the monster of propaganda reduced to a middle-aged man in borrowed clothes, his face altered by a cheap disguise. Himmler himself offered no dramatic resistance or final statement. He accepted the discovery with the same outward calm he had shown in countless meetings, though those who observed him closely noted the way his shoulders sagged and his eyes lost their usual focused intensity. In the immediate aftermath of capture, the human reality of his situation became inescapable. He was searched, questioned, and placed under guard like any other prisoner. The eye patch was removed. The false papers were taken away. For the first time in years he had no authority, no staff, no ability to issue orders that would be obeyed. The men guarding him were ordinary soldiers doing their duty, not the ideologically driven followers he had once commanded. They treated him with professional correctness rather than the fear or reverence he had grown accustomed to receiving. This ordinary treatment must have felt like its own form of humiliation. The man who had once decided who lived and who died was now dependent on the procedures and decisions of others. Small kindnesses, a cup of water, a moment to sit down, came not from loyal subordinates but from captors who saw him as just another prisoner to be processed. The emotional consequences of this collapse rippled outward from Himmler himself. Those who had remained loyal to him until the end now faced their own uncertain futures. Some were captured alongside him. Others scattered into the chaos, carrying the knowledge that their former leader had tried to abandon the cause they had served together. For the broader world, the image of Himmler in disguise became a symbol of how even the most powerful figures in a tyrannical regime could be reduced to pathetic attempts at escape when that regime fell. The contrast between the man who had once stood at Hitler's side issuing orders for mass murder and the man caught trying to slip through a checkpoint in a false identity offered a stark illustration of how power can evaporate and how those who wield it often prove far more ordinary in defeat than their public personas suggested. Preserving the full, unvarnished record of how even the most powerful perpetrators ultimately faced consequences requires ongoing dedication and resources. If the history we are exploring together has moved you, and if you believe these warnings must be kept alive for new generations, even a small tip on Ko-Fi, as little as $1, helps support the research and the time it takes to craft these narratives responsibly. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Himmler's desperate attempt to disappear did not mark the end of his story, but it did mark the final collapse of the carefully constructed identity he had maintained for so long. The man without a face, stripped of his mustache, his uniform, and his authority, was now simply another prisoner in a system that would eventually hold him accountable. The journey from the heights of power to a borrowed eye patch and a false name had been swift and humiliating. It revealed the fragility of even the most seemingly invincible figures when the structures that supported them began to fail. In those final days of disguise and flight, Heinrich Himmler was forced to confront the same human vulnerabilities he had spent years inflicting on others. The result was not dignity or redemption but a quiet, almost absurd reduction to the ordinary. That reduction, more than any dramatic confrontation or final act of defiance, stands as the true measure of how thoroughly his world had come undone. In a small British interrogation room near the end of a war that had consumed millions of lives, the man who had directed the machinery of mass death found himself stripped of power, subjected to the same kind of examination he had once ordered for others, and faced with a choice that would define how his story ended. Heinrich Himmler had been captured days earlier while trying to slip through the chaos of a collapsing Germany under a false name and a crude disguise. The British soldiers who first detained him had no idea who they had in their custody. To them he was simply another weary figure among the thousands of displaced people and defeated soldiers moving across the ruined landscape. It was only after routine checks and a closer look at his papers that suspicion grew. When the truth emerged, the atmosphere around him changed almost immediately. Word spread quickly through the British units that they held one of the highest-ranking and most notorious figures of the Nazi regime. For the men guarding him, the discovery brought a mixture of professional satisfaction and a strange sense of anticlimax. The monster they had heard about in briefings and news reports was now a middle-aged man sitting quietly in a holding area, no longer issuing orders or commanding fear. Himmler himself seemed to accept his situation with outward calm. He had spent years cultivating an image of discipline and control, and even in captivity he maintained a composed demeanor. Yet beneath that surface, those who observed him closely noticed the strain. His eyes moved constantly, taking in every detail of his surroundings as if still calculating his options. He answered initial questions in the same measured tone he had always used in meetings, offering short, careful responses that revealed little. He knew the weight of what he had done. He understood that capture meant he would face judgment for the camps, the killings, the entire apparatus of terror he had helped build. The realization did not lead him to dramatic displays of emotion or desperate pleas. Instead, it seemed to settle into a quiet, private calculation about how he might still control the manner of his own ending. The process of identification and initial interrogation took place in a series of small, functional rooms at a British facility near Lüneburg. Officers questioned him about his identity, his role in the SS, and his knowledge of orders given during the final months of the war. Himmler responded with the same bureaucratic precision that had defined his career. He admitted who he was without hesitation once confronted with evidence, but he offered little in the way of new information or remorse. His answers stayed within the narrow boundaries of what he considered safe to reveal. Those conducting the questioning noted how he seemed to retreat into the familiar role of administrator, treating the interrogation as another meeting where facts needed to be managed rather than a confrontation with the human cost of his actions. This detachment was not new. It had allowed him to oversee mass murder from a distance for years. Now it served as a final shield against the reality of his own capture. A medical examination was ordered as part of standard procedure for high-value prisoners. Himmler was taken to a room where British doctors and officers prepared to search him thoroughly. For a man who had spent his life issuing commands and maintaining strict control over his image, this moment carried a particular humiliation. He was asked to remove his clothing. His body, which he had always treated with a kind of obsessive discipline, was now subject to the clinical gaze of his captors. The examination was thorough and impersonal. The doctors were performing their duty, checking for hidden weapons or documents, treating him as they would any other prisoner. Yet for Himmler the experience must have felt like the final stripping away of everything he had built. The man who had once decided who would live and who would die was now reduced to standing naked under the eyes of men who saw him as nothing more than a dangerous captive to be processed. It was during this examination that Himmler made his final choice. Hidden in his mouth was a small glass capsule containing cyanide. He had carried it for months, prepared for the possibility that capture or defeat might come. As the doctors and officers worked around him, he bit down on the capsule. The poison acted quickly. Within moments he collapsed. The room erupted into sudden activity as those present realized what had happened. Attempts were made to revive him, but the cyanide had done its work too fast. Heinrich Himmler died on the floor of that small room, not in a dramatic final stand or a public reckoning, but in a quiet, private act of self-destruction that denied his captors and the world the chance to put him on trial. The reactions in the room were a mixture of shock, frustration, and a strange sense of relief mixed with disappointment. The British personnel had hoped to bring such a high-profile prisoner to justice through formal proceedings. Instead, they were left with a body and the knowledge that he had chosen to escape accountability on his own terms. Some felt anger that he had denied victims and survivors the satisfaction of seeing him face judgment. Others simply processed the event as another grim task in the long work of dealing with the aftermath of war. Word of his death spread quickly through the British units and then outward to the wider world. For many who had suffered under the regime he helped create, the news arrived with a complex mix of emotions. There was a sense that one of the architects of terror was gone, yet the manner of his death left an unfinished feeling. He had avoided the public trial that might have forced a fuller accounting of what had been done. Himmler's wife and daughter received the news in the days that followed. Margaret Himmler, who had shared in the privileges of his position during the years of power, now faced the reality of being the widow of a man whose name would forever be linked to some of the worst crimes of the century. Their daughter Gudrun, who had been raised in the shadow of her father's status and ideology, learned of his death while still young. The family's response was private, shaped by grief, shock, and the sudden loss of the world they had known. For them, as for many families connected to high-ranking Nazis, the end of the war brought not only personal loss but the beginning of a long process of reckoning with what their loved one had represented. Letters and personal records from this period show the human struggle of trying to reconcile private memories of a husband or father with the public reality of his actions. The manner of Himmler's death carried a particular weight when set against the scale of suffering he had helped inflict. He had overseen systems that sent millions to their deaths through starvation, shooting, gassing, and forced labor. Those victims had rarely been given any choice in how their lives ended. Many had faced their final moments in terror, stripped of dignity and hope. Himmler, by contrast, had carried the means of a quick and relatively painless exit with him for months. He had chosen the moment and the method. This contrast did not go unnoticed by those who survived or by the families of the dead. His suicide was seen by many as an act of cowardice, a final refusal to face the consequences of what he had done. It offered no apology, no public acknowledgement of guilt, and no opportunity for victims to confront him directly. The capsule in his mouth had allowed him to slip away from judgment in much the same way he had once tried to slip away from capture through disguise. Yet even in this private ending there were elements that reflected the human complexity of the moment. The British personnel who witnessed his death had to process what it meant to stand over the body of a man responsible for so much horror. Some later spoke of the strange ordinariness of the scene. There was no dramatic final speech, no last gesture of defiance. Just a man who had chosen to end his own life rather than face what was coming. For the wider world, his death closed one chapter but left many questions unanswered. How could one man have played such a central role in such vast crimes? What combination of ideology, ambition, and personal weakness had allowed him to continue even when the human cost became impossible to ignore? His suicide did not provide answers. It simply removed the possibility of hearing them from him directly. The immediate aftermath of his death involved practical matters that underscored how thoroughly his power had vanished. His body was handled according to standard procedures for prisoners who died in custody. There was no state funeral, no honors, no final public display of the authority he had once wielded. His family was notified through official channels. The news reached Germany and the rest of the world through radio broadcasts and newspapers. For many survivors of the camps and the killings, the report that Himmler was dead arrived with a sense of grim finality. One chapter of the terror had ended, but the work of understanding, remembering, and seeking some form of justice would continue for decades. His choice to end his life rather than face trial meant that the full story of his decisions would have to be pieced together from documents, testimony of subordinates, and the memories of victims rather than from his own words in a courtroom. The deeper questions raised by his death touch on the limits of individual accountability when crimes have been committed on such a massive scale. Himmler had been one man among many who built and operated the machinery of the Holocaust and the broader Nazi terror. His suicide removed him from any formal process of justice, yet it did not erase the systems he had helped create or the suffering those systems caused. Families who had lost loved ones in the camps or through mass shootings would never have the chance to see him answer for those losses in person. At the same time, his death served as a reminder that even those who seemed to hold absolute power could not ultimately escape the consequences of their actions, even if they chose to meet those consequences on their own terms. The cyanide capsule represented both an escape and an acknowledgement that the world he had helped shape no longer had a place for him. For those who had served under him or supported the regime, his death also carried personal implications. Some felt a sense of abandonment, as if their leader had chosen to leave them to face the reckoning alone. Others saw it as a final act of loyalty or defiance, though such interpretations struggled against the reality that he had tried to negotiate his own survival through secret channels right up until the end. The human stories connected to his death are many and varied. A British soldier who helped guard his body later spoke of the quiet professionalism required to handle such a moment without giving in to personal anger. A survivor of one of the camps heard the news on a radio in a displaced persons center and felt a complicated mixture of relief and lingering pain, knowing that one source of terror was gone but that the memories would remain. These individual responses remind us that even the ending of a single life, when that life has been tied to such vast events, ripples outward in ways that touch countless others. The final, private moment of a man who had sent millions to their deaths now facing his own end raises profound questions about justice, accountability, and the limits of individual punishment when crimes have been committed on such an enormous scale. If you want to explore these questions more deeply and join ongoing conversations with others who are grappling with the same difficult history, our Patreon community offers a space for exactly that kind of dialogue. There you can access free bonus podcasts, raw and unblurred video segments that complement these narrations, early access to future episodes, and discussions with fellow truth seekers who refuse to look away from even the most uncomfortable parts of the past. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Heinrich Himmler's death by cyanide did not bring dramatic closure to the story of the Holocaust or the Nazi regime. It simply marked the end of one man's ability to continue shaping events. The systems he had helped build continued to unwind in the weeks and months that followed. Trials would eventually be held for other high-ranking figures. Documents would be gathered and preserved. Survivors would begin the long process of rebuilding lives and telling their stories. Himmler's choice to end his own life rather than face public judgment left a particular kind of absence. There would be no final testimony from him, no moment where he was forced to confront the faces of those he had harmed or the full weight of what had been done under his authority. Instead, his story ends with a quiet collapse in a small room, witnessed by captors who saw him as a prisoner rather than a figure of power. That ending, ordinary in its mechanics yet extraordinary in its context, stands as a final illustration of how even those who seem to control the machinery of history can be reduced to the most basic human acts when that machinery fails. The man who had once believed he was building an eternal order died trying to escape the consequences of what he had built, leaving behind questions that history would continue to ask long after his body was gone. The man who once believed he could shape history through shadows and silence left behind more than ruins and graves. He left us with questions that still echo in our own time about how ordinary people can be drawn into extraordinary darkness, and what it takes to keep that darkness from returning. In the years after the war ended, survivors and liberators walked through the gates of camps that had once operated under Heinrich Himmler's authority. They found emaciated bodies, abandoned files, and the lingering silence of places where human beings had been reduced to numbers. For those who had endured the camps, the moment of liberation brought relief mixed with grief that would never fully lift. One survivor later described standing outside the barbed wire on the day of freedom and feeling not joy but a profound emptiness, as if the part of himself that had once believed in simple human decency had been left behind inside those fences. He spoke of small acts that had kept him alive, a shared crust of bread passed between prisoners, a whispered word of encouragement when all hope seemed lost. Those moments of quiet kindness became the stories he carried forward, not as proof that goodness always triumphs, but as evidence that even in the most systematic cruelty, the human impulse toward connection can persist if people choose to nurture it. The trials that followed at Nuremberg brought some of Himmler's subordinates and collaborators into courtrooms where the world could hear, for the first time in full detail, how the machinery of terror had functioned. Prosecutors presented documents, photographs, and testimony that revealed the bureaucratic precision with which mass murder had been organized. Witnesses described the everyday routines of camp guards, the meetings where officials discussed train schedules and body disposal as if they were managing any other large enterprise. What emerged was not a story of monsters from another world but of men who had once lived ordinary lives, fathers, husbands, clerks, and administrators, who had allowed themselves to become instruments of a system that treated human lives as expendable resources. The concept later called the banality of evil took shape in those courtrooms. It was not that the perpetrators lacked intelligence or education. Many were highly capable. It was that they had learned to separate their actions from their sense of themselves as decent people. They followed orders, met quotas, and filed reports while the human cost remained abstract, filed away in the same folders as supply requests and personnel assignments. For the families of victims, the trials offered a partial form of accountability but never complete healing. A woman whose entire family had been murdered in the camps traveled to Nuremberg to hear the proceedings. She sat in the gallery and listened as men described the policies that had taken her husband, her children, and her parents. She noticed how some of the defendants seemed almost bored during the testimony, as if the numbers and procedures they had once managed had never been connected to real human beings. After one particularly long day of evidence, she wrote in a letter to a surviving cousin that she felt both exhausted and strangely detached. The men on trial were not the ones who had pulled triggers or herded people into gas chambers with their own hands. They were the ones who had made the decisions that made those actions possible. She wondered whether any punishment could ever match the scale of what had been lost. Her letter did not call for revenge. It expressed a quieter, more enduring need, that the world remember how such decisions had been made, so that others might recognize the warning signs before it happened again. The lessons from Himmler's era reach beyond the specific crimes of the Nazi regime. They touch on how democratic societies can be hollowed out from within when fear, propaganda, and bureaucratic efficiency combine to erode individual responsibility. Ordinary citizens in Germany during the 1930s did not wake up one morning and decide to support mass murder. They adjusted, step by small step, to a changing political landscape. Some joined the Nazi Party because it offered jobs or status. Others remained silent because speaking out seemed too dangerous or pointless. Teachers adjusted their lessons to fit new ideological requirements. Police officers enforced laws that gradually stripped rights from targeted groups. Each adjustment felt manageable on its own. Only in hindsight did the full pattern become visible. The same pattern appears in other times and places where authoritarian movements gain ground: the normalization of dehumanizing language, the gradual acceptance of emergency measures that bypass normal protections, the quiet complicity of institutions that choose institutional survival over moral clarity. Himmler himself embodied one version of this process. He was not born a monster. He grew up in a respectable family, struggled with his own physical limitations, and searched for belonging and purpose in a Germany still reeling from defeat in the First World War. He found that purpose in an ideology that offered clear enemies, a vision of restored strength, and a community that rewarded loyalty above all else. Each step he took, from joining early political groups, to building the SS, to overseeing the expansion of camps, could be justified in the moment as necessary for the greater good he believed he was serving. The human cost became visible only when he chose to look away from it. That choice was not forced upon him by some external power. It was a series of decisions he made, day after day, year after year, until the machinery he helped create operated with a momentum that seemed beyond any single person's control. The lesson is not that evil arrives suddenly in dramatic uniforms. It often arrives in the form of reasonable-sounding arguments about security, efficiency, and the need to protect one's own group from imagined threats. The SS and Gestapo did not operate in isolation. They depended on the cooperation, or at least the passive acceptance, of millions of ordinary people across Europe. Some collaborated out of conviction. Others did so out of fear or opportunism. Still others simply tried to keep their heads down and survive. In occupied countries, local police forces sometimes assisted in roundups. Civil servants processed the paperwork that made deportations possible. Neighbors turned a blind eye when families disappeared. These were not abstract choices. They were made by individuals who had to live with the consequences in their own communities and their own consciences. After the war, some of those individuals spent decades trying to explain to themselves and to others why they had acted as they did. Their stories reveal the same pattern seen in Himmler's own life: the human capacity to rationalize, to compartmentalize, and to redefine decency in ways that allow terrible things to continue. Yet alongside these stories of complicity run stories of resistance and quiet courage that offer a different kind of lesson. In ghettos and camps, prisoners organized mutual aid, shared information, and maintained cultural and spiritual life even when every external force sought to destroy it. Outside the camps, individuals and small networks risked everything to hide Jews, forge documents, and smuggle people to safety. These acts often began with a single decision: a door opened to a stranger, a false identity paper passed in secret, a warning whispered at the right moment. The people who made those choices were not superheroes. They were ordinary men and women who, at a critical moment, decided that their own safety mattered less than another person's life. Their stories do not erase the larger tragedy, but they demonstrate that even within systems designed to crush individual moral choice, that choice can still be exercised. The cost was often high. Many resistors were caught and killed. Their families suffered. Yet the fact that some people made those choices, even when success seemed impossible, remains one of the most important counterweights to the narrative of inevitable darkness. The concept of never again emerged from the ashes of the Holocaust as both a promise and a warning. It was not meant to be a slogan that could be repeated without cost. It was meant to demand ongoing vigilance, watching for the early signs of dehumanization, questioning the concentration of unchecked power, refusing to accept that any group of people can be defined as less than fully human. That vigilance is not the responsibility of governments alone. It belongs to individuals who read the news, who vote, who speak up in their workplaces and communities, and who teach the next generation what happened when those responsibilities were neglected. The history of Himmler and the organizations he built shows how quickly democratic norms can erode when fear is cultivated, when institutions are captured by ideology, and when ordinary people decide that their own comfort matters more than the rights of others. It also shows that those erosions do not happen without human agency. People choose to participate, to remain silent, or to resist. Those choices accumulate into larger patterns that either strengthen or weaken the protections that make civilized life possible. In the decades since the war, efforts to document and remember the Holocaust have taken many forms. Survivors have written memoirs and given testimony. Historians have pieced together archives that reveal how decisions were made at every level. Museums and memorials have been built in the places where the worst atrocities occurred. These efforts are not simply about preserving the past. They are about equipping people in the present to recognize when similar patterns begin to appear. A young person reading a survivor's account of being transported in a cattle car may never face that exact horror, but they can learn to notice when language that treats certain groups as less than human begins to circulate in their own society. They can learn to question policies that strip rights from targeted populations under the guise of security or efficiency. They can learn that the first steps toward catastrophe often look reasonable to those who take them. The lessons from Himmler's shadow are not only about preventing the worst crimes. They are also about understanding how power operates in quieter ways. The SS and Gestapo did not rely solely on dramatic violence. They relied on information, on the fear that any neighbor might be an informant, on the slow normalization of surveillance and arbitrary authority. These methods created a society in which trust eroded and people learned to police their own words and thoughts. The same dynamics can appear in any society where governments expand their reach into private life without sufficient checks, where media and technology amplify division and fear, and where institutions that should protect individual rights instead prioritize their own preservation. Recognizing these patterns requires the same kind of attention to small details that Himmler himself brought to his work: the careful reading of documents, the tracking of how language shapes reality, the willingness to see how ordinary administrative decisions can accumulate into something monstrous. Understanding the hidden operations and quiet decisions that shape history is exactly what helps us recognize when those patterns begin to repeat. If you want to explore these lessons further and stay connected to stories that reveal how ordinary choices can lead to extraordinary consequences, I invite you to sign up for our free email newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive the powerful ebook The Shadow War, 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II, along with weekly deep dive articles that uncover forgotten stories of espionage, resistance, and the hidden battles that decided the fate of nations. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The story of Heinrich Himmler does not end with his death in a British interrogation room. It continues in the choices people make every day about whether to look away from suffering, whether to accept dehumanizing language as normal, and whether to believe that their own small actions cannot possibly matter in the face of larger forces. The men and women who resisted during the darkest years often started with nothing more than a refusal to participate in one particular injustice. The bureaucrats who enabled mass murder often started with nothing more than a willingness to treat one group of people as a problem to be solved rather than as fellow human beings. Both paths were open then, and both paths remain open now. The difference lies in which one people choose to walk. Remembering what happened when those choices were made under Himmler's authority is not an act of nostalgia or guilt. It is an act of preparation. It equips us to notice when the same patterns begin to form in our own time and to decide, before it is too late, that we will not let them take root. The shadow he cast was long and terrible. The light that can push it back still depends on ordinary people deciding, again and again, that the values worth defending are worth defending even when doing so carries a cost. That decision, made in countless small moments by countless individuals, is what keeps the promise of never again from becoming an empty phrase and turns it instead into a living practice. The history we have walked through together shows both how far human beings can fall and how stubbornly they can choose to rise. The choice remains ours to make.